conference for everyone. Yesterday, we had panels on Luke and Acts within Judaism and then Hebrews within Judaism. In fact, we're very happy here. We have at least two of the panelists that were on the Hebrews within Judaism for this recap session this morning. Madison Pierce, who has kindly agreed and volunteered to share some of her thoughts and impressions on any of the things that you, Madison, would like to highlight. We'll provide you with a few minutes to do that. I see that Eric Knopf is here as well and was also a panelist, and Jean-Claude Verrecchia too. And so if you would like to, you're not obliged, but you can also chime in. It's a very busy time of the week of the month for many of us. So unfortunately, we don't have anybody from the Luke panel that I was able to successfully
You
recruit.
were
Although
kidding.
I hate to talk about Luke. I talk about Luke all the time, so it'd be great if somebody else came. I mean, I like Luke, but Paul Sloan might join us. In fact, he had indicated he was willing to make a summary, so maybe he will join us in time for that. So what we have today is this recap session. Thereafter, okay, so Paul Sloan is actually in the attendee room, Megan. So if you don't mind transferring to our panel, that would be great. We'll start with a summary then, with summaries, comments about the Hebrews panel, and then we can talk a little bit about Luke. We will wrap this recap session at around I'm always having to transfer the time zone here since I'm in Central Time. 8:50, 8:55 a.m.-ish. So we have a little bit of time, little small break before we start our first panel for today, which will be on John within Judaism, followed by our last panel, which is miscellany, a variety of literature that we've tried to choose to sample that is stretching beyond the New Testament canon within Judaism. But without further ado, I'm going to allow Madison Pierce to go ahead and speak first about how you thought or what you want to say about the Hebrews panel.
Thanks, Isaac. There are a lot of things that happened yesterday, and I hope that the other panelists from the Hebrews group will chime in as well. It seemed to be the case that we were all relatively okay with Hebrews being interpreted within Judaism, but recognize the limitations of that label, as others have noted. It came up that one of the key questions with Hebrews is the ethnicity of the author. There are also questions related to this relevant to the dating of Hebrews, though a lot of us in Hebrew scholarship consider this to be pretty challenging to nail down. And so I know that and I think others tried to couch our conversations about the with Judaism isness without coming to a particular position on that. We differed quite a lot when it came down to the specifics, wondering in which ways the author is moving beyond the Jewish identity or Jewish practices that they've inherited, to what extent they would be at odds with other Jewish groups or sects. And if the author would indeed continue to understand themselves within the Jewish moniker. So that's probably a good starting point.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Madison. After these sessions, Gabriele and I have a sort of our own informal recap session, and we're just saying how we really were the Hebrews panel. I mean, all of the panels have been enjoyable, but there was something particularly enjoyable for us about the Hebrews panel, in as much as it was the first time we had a panel on Hebrews within Judaism. And so therefore, really interesting to see some of the questions that come up when we bring these questions to that panel on Hebrews. Eric Knopf, you're under no obligation, but this is opportunity if you'd like to share some impressions about yesterday. This invitation is extended as well to Jean-Claude Verrecchia Yeah, and in fact, anyone who's on the screen here who was present yesterday.
Well, if I may add one thing that I found quite interesting, it was the fact that we traditionally, the letter to the Hebrews is the, you know, new against old. Everything that was all this, okay, it's gone. It doesn't matter anymore. While in many of the, much part of the discussion of yesterday, well, this was put in question a lot. So how much is the new changing the old? And I thought, sorry, that was really fascinating. Something really trying to give um, some new nuances to this discussion, and I found that it quite intriguing. So it's really that is one example, but I have the feeling that also other things we were in some way forced to rethink some old how can I say, things that were we thought that were fixed, were clear. But yesterday I thought that okay, maybe many things are have to be rediscussed. Even the date. I'm a pro no yes, I'm in favor of a dating of the letter before the destruction of the temple. But I used to think that most of the scholars were in favor of dating after 70. Yesterday, many people, more than I expected, were thinking, okay, maybe it's pre-70. Okay, so there, I think we got good glimpses, good ideas for the future.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's always good to, in this kind of setting, and we're trying to promote a workshop style brainstorming, inviting different ideas, even divergent ideas on this topic. So why not entertain a pre-70 dating? That goes even for
Mhm.
Luke and Acts, if I may dare. And speaking of Luke and Acts, we do have one of the panelists who was there from yesterday, who made a presentation, Paul Sloan.
Great. I'll do my best, even though I now know that you didn't like our discussion as much as you liked the one at Hebrews. But it was maybe you just know Luke Acts too well. So, well, thanks. I'll begin with a few summarizing comments on the paper. Jocelyn McWhorter showed the Jewishness of Jesus by highlighting the ways in which the author likens its protagonists to prophet figures from Tanakh, noting that Luke characterizes those protagonists in ways that only readers of the Tanakh would actually have understood and appreciated. And Jin Young Kim highlighted the ways in which Luke's episode with the boy Jesus being left in the temple could be read therapeutically by Jewish and Gentile readers who had been negatively affected by the Jewish war, and suggesting that the ambiguity of his answer, that he was going to be among the things of his father, could have led readers to kind of confront their painful memories, but kind of put them in a new framework. My own paper suggested that because within Judaism is associated with the school primarily, not because that label began with its association with the school, Paul within Judaism, it may be too closely associated with a set of conclusions rather than a method, which may then skew attempts to apply this label broadly to other literary corpora without also kind of assuming that some of those conclusions would be transferred over. Obviously, not everyone would do that, but it's the risk I see in trying to use the label. Um, and then my own paper was on sort of the restoration eschatology of Luke Acts. Eyal Regev and Fadi Atef Mikhail, they walked through a lot of the episodes in Luke Acts in which the temple is used positively, or in positive moments, like Jesus teaching, the apostle teaching, things like that. And kind of suggested that its frequent usage indicates both the Jewishness of the text, but also Lukács's positive evaluation of this national institution. But in the discussion, I kind of grouped this into three broad topics. More than these topics came up, but the first basic question was, what rhetorical end does the Jewishness of Luke Acts serve? So, Jason Wendell and Jason Marath both noted that the Jewishness of Luke Acts has long been noted. The question is, what purpose does its Jewishness accomplish, and what's our point in pointing it out? So Wendell, for example, noted that many of us will point out the Jewishness of the text, but 19th century German scholars were also pointing out and noting the Jewishness of Luke Acts, but they viewed that as a negative. And their response was to criticize Luke Acts for that very reason. And Marath, Jason, we had three Jasons in the program. So Jason Marath also pointed out that simply identifying, Jewish characteristics doesn't sufficiently address sort of what that Jewishness signifies for the author. And he rightly noted, by and large, this was a point that I took home after the discussion. He rightly noted that the discussion of the Jewish people was left out of much of the scholarly discussion. So he asks, is Luke just interested in Jewish things or Jewish people? Is it just Jews arguing with Jews, or is it like later apologists in subsequent centuries who will, appropriate the Jewish heritage but apply it to others while keeping, actual Jews at arm's length? Then we distinguished sectarianism from groupness, or groups have boundaries, but that doesn't mean that they are sects, right? They could still think everyone outside their group is okay. Whereas a sect might be more, also has a groupness, but thinks that those outside of the sect should join it, or else they might come under, divine judgment. Talked a good bit about that. And then the final one was we reflected on the polemics of Luke Acts. And so, for example, Jocelyn McWhorter noted that, yes, we can compare Jesus to the prophets and sort of in the prophetic indictments that you see there and the kind of language you see there, but the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees are still quite stark. And so we kind of asked ourselves, what are we to make of this? And that caused us to reflect on the fact that, yes, other Second Temple texts, I mean, this came up a lot, just because we can situate Luke Acts within a sort of the polemical context of late Second Temple Judaism, especially like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and note that they also have that kind of polemic. We still kind of have to ask the question why it feels different here. And Joshua Jipp and Isaac Oliver mentioned that it could be that it both feels and has actually been historically distinct, is that the polemic in the New Testament has been preserved in a sacred text that's eventually been read and studied and used predominantly by non-Jews, which of course is different how the Dead Sea Scrolls was treated. Anyway, that's probably overkill for that, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I do like Luke. I just want to give other people opportunity to do that. And that was a really nice summary, fine summary. In fact, if I'm going to say anything about Luke, I'll be self-promotional here since the news just came out yesterday from De Gruyter, BZNW. There is a volume that will come out, heaven's willing, Luke and Acts. With or within, you can see the title, how it's phrased, Second Temple Judaism. And that brings me back to one issue that Matt Jackson McCabe brought up actually during the James and First Peter panel within Judaism, was he was taking some issue, not so much with the term Judaism, although he did that too, but with also this word within, right? Within. So you can see that hesitation is reflected in the selection of the title of this forthcoming book, which has finally been approved and is going to the next steps of production. I don't know. I see some others are here. I don't want to put you on the spotlight unless you want to. This is your grand moment. For example, Jean-Claude Verrecaille, coming back to the Hebrews panel. I don't know if you wanted to share any thoughts, reflections on that panel. Under no obligation. Gabriele, you already having a conference before the conference was even started and with Jörg Frey, so I don't know if you want to share some thoughts as well.
No, just briefly, two points that came from the panel of yesterday, apart the ones that have been already presented. The first problem is terminology. I mean, we know we have clear the starting point. Christianity was born as a messianic and apocalyptic Jewish group, and we know the end game. Christianity and Judaism became two separate autonomous religions. Our problem is to identify and to define properly the intermediate stages in this process that did not happen overnight, but was a very long and gradual process. So we need a narrative and a terminology that makes sense not only of the starting point within Judaism or outside Judaism, but makes sense also of the intermediate stages. because it was not, I repeat, an overnight transition between within Judaism and outside Judaism. Okay, this is, I think, came very strongly yesterday. Another element is that I saw in many the concern that denote in the text, the New Testament text, as Jewish or studied within Judaism, this should not be presented as making this text less Christian. So if we say that the text is Jewish, a New Testament text is Jewish, or should be read within Judaism, does not mean that should not be read within Christianity, or is no longer or does not belong to Christianity or to the Jesus movement. So we should also make a stronger effort to clarify the relationship between the self-awareness of being part of a larger Jewish religion and being part of a specific group within the Jewish religion. So the discussion that we had about groupness or sectarianism or even supersessionism, because we have a certain tendency to supersessionism even in groups that identify themselves as Jewish groups and were in competition with other Jewish groups. So again, from our panels, what came out clearly is the complexity of the problems, of the phenomena that we want to describe, and the insufficiency of our narrative and of our categories.
Thanks for sharing that. In fact, yesterday, one of the aspects that I found interesting with the Hebrews panel was how some of the panelists pointed out the lack of polemics in the document against other, Jews, Israelites who may not share the same confession, at least in the rhetoric of the letter, and how the author seems to really identify with the Israelite tradition and is very, very familiar with that tradition, which raised some interesting questions about the identity of the author proper. And I'm wondering if I will now phrase this in the following way. Hebrews is Hebrew till proven otherwise. But with regard to all of the panels, with this discussion about within Judaism, because I've been reading some research on French Jewry, I came across Albert Memmi, and there's some caution here because he's dealing with modern Franco-Judaism, but divides it into three categories: Judaïté, which would be identification with the Jewish people, with the Jewish history, with Jewish identity. Judaïcité, which would be participation in Jewish institutions. And then finally, Judaïté or Judaism, which is the Jewish religion proper. Now, of course, we as ancient historians would take issue with dividing or separating history from the rest of Jewish identity for the pre-modern period. But there's maybe this way of approaching Judaism might be helpful because on the one hand, we have some texts, it seems to me, that are more polemical towards, or speak more polemically towards the Jewish institutions. And that might be a segue even to what's going to happen in John within Judaism. I don't want to influence the conversation there, but the way that the Judaioi are talked about, or the synagogue. So to what extent are the members or the authors, the communities, however we want to phrase this or imagine this, still participating or identifying with the institutions, even if they are strongly affirming the Jewish tradition, the Jewish history, and so forth. So should we think of within Judaism then more as within Judaïté, to borrow from Albert Memmi? To what extent are they still participating within Judaïcité? So just throwing that out there because it came up when I was thinking about this matter with the letter to the Hebrews in particular. But it's pertinent to all of the literature I think that we're covering and that we will cover today. We do have maybe time for one more comment or reflection before we take a slight break here to prepare for our John within Judaism session.
I'll just add, because it seems like it'll be relevant for John, though I don't know what y'all are going to say, and I'm not a panelist there. Something that came up, you mentioned it, Josh Chitt mentioned it, and someone else mentioned, I think maybe Jason Wendell mentioned it in the Luke Acts panel about sort of when asking the to describe the Jewishness of XYZ, or is this within Judaism or whatever. Of course, also would then depend on, right, the person you're asking. Obviously, if you asked Luke, he'd probably say yes. But if you asked the chief priest on the other end of Stephen's speech, I'm not sure he would say that. You know, he would say, no, you got, you know. And it seems that I mean, again, I don't know what's about to happen in John, but I could see how John is going to say, well, sure, I'm doing the Jewish thing here. But that non, even both non-Christian non-Christian Jews at the time of John and, Jews now would be like, no, this is the most anti-Jewish text we've ever read. I could see how you could come to that conclusion. But it wouldn't necessarily, indicate that speaks on John's behalf, right? Or Luke Acts in the case that I was talking about. That won't speak for you guys. I thought that was it's just irrelevant to question, because once you're asking the within question, you're asking a spatial question. And once you're asking a spatial question, you're invoking boundaries, and so that depends on what side of the boundary you're going to be on. To even answer the question, you can answer it differently. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So it also is relevant to the third question, what changes if we're saying this is within Judaism? So what? Why are we doing this? But I'll allow Madison Pierce to have some final comments before we move on. Go ahead.
Forgive me. And I think what Paul was describing there also is relevant for part of the conversation that we had regarding Hebrews, and maybe a desire among interpreters to render Hebrews palatable, and to present the author as less supersessionist than they are. I mean, I think that's an ongoing question. Are our own ideologies pressing us to put these authors in a particular box or our contemporary situation? So I still stand by my reading of the author, but I could be very wrong, and yeah, I'm open to that.
Thanks for that. We are going to here just take a little break so we can make sure that some of the panelists of John who have just joined us, everything's functional. People can take a little break. We will start again in about 7 minutes on my clock, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for our John within Judaism. See you soon. So Laura, I know you just joined us, Laura Hunt. Nice to meet you, and Douglas Estes. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, I want to get it right. So is it Estes? Is that what you prefer, or how's it?
Yeah, I mean, just different dialect in the US, so the latter
Okay,
is probably better. But yeah,
Estes.
yeah.
Okay, very good. Do you need to do a PowerPoint presentation, either of you?
No.
Okay,
Yeah, it's fine.
excellent. Wonderful. I know some of the panelists are here for the next panel, and that's fine. You can keep your screen turned off during the John within Judaism, and then we will do some testing right after the John within Judaism panel is finished. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments. I put the link there for the schedule in the chat box somewhere, and I might just post it again. We're just going to follow in the order that's listed on the schedule for the presentations, but I will say those words before we start. Okay, well, I'll be right
Maybe we may continue our private conference. No, just welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invitation.
We are not private. There are 58 people around, as you can see.
I know it's recording this part, Isaac.
Right. It's still being live streamed, I think.
Okay.
I think. Just so be
So
wary.
be cautious. Be cautious what you say.
Right. Now we will edit the video right at Megan Wines will do editing and upload on YouTube without this section here. But right now we might be on YouTube live, just so
We
you know.
are, and it will be there. I haven't edited any of the videos when we're live. They just stay on YouTube, which is why they have been up so fast. But I will go back through in the next
Oh,
month
great.
to
Oh, yeah.
edit out these bits. But if you share this video like tomorrow, this all will be in it.
All right. Thanks for that
We are
clarification.
only expressing friendship and collegiality. So
Gabriele, are you sharing this?
I can if you like.
It's as you wish. We kind of just improvise with the chairing here. If you're up to it.
Always did so well. So if you feel like doing it, it'll be fine to me.
Okay. I mean, I don't mind if you do it, but
I think that for the continuity of the conference, I mean,
okay.
you're
All
doing
right.
such a
Sounds good.
job.
Fair enough.
And I will be here in any case, Isaac. As
Right.
we
If
have
we need to
always
rotate
done,
at some point.
rotate at some
Yeah.
point. I mean, I may also need some breaks
Right.
so for-
It's a marathon.
yes, the marathon.
3 days in a row. It's been like what, 6 hours for those who chair nonstop. So congratulations on your book, Ugo.
Oh, thank you.
I
I
haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm very eager to take a look.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks.
I didn't see it either. But it has not yet come over across the ocean.
Yeah, it's really weird. Yeah, like the United States release date was like in July, but I have more than one person from Europe telling me it's not slated until October, November over there. So yeah.
It's like Hollywood movies, the release dates are different depending on the continent.
We're all looking for the good tariffs.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunately more the truth. How are you doing? You're coming from a conference, I just heard.
You mean me?
Yes.
Well, I was. We had the Colloquium Johanneum in Thessaloniki.
Oh, of course, yes.
Where Catherine was missing, unfortunately, but that was a very good conference organized by Christos Karakolis. So we did John 9 and 10, and it was really, really nice.
Very, very nice.
And I'm looking forward to the panel in Boston with you, Hugo.
Oh, yeah. Also, Thessaloniki, and that's just a gorgeous place to be, especially for the temperate weather in Greece. Yeah.
Was it hot though, Jörg?
It was okay. It was okay.
Really?
In Philippi, it was a bit for the elderly participants. It was a bit stressful, but anyway.
Good.
Right. It is 9 a.m. So we will start Eastern Standard Time, that is. I want to welcome everyone who is watching here or who will watch this later on the YouTube channel of the Enoch Seminar to this panel on John within Judaism. Incidentally, for those who did miss panels from yesterday or the day before, those videos are already uploaded on the Enoch Seminar YouTube channel, and we might provide links for that in the chat box. In fact, feel free for those who are attending, as well as the panelists, if you want to chit and chatter using the chat box, that is like a parallel dimension that happens during the sessions. And so you are encouraged and welcome to do that. Today we have first John within Judaism. As I stated, the makeup of this panel is slightly different. We will have six presentations, six presenters who have up to 10 minutes each to talk about the three common questions that have been asked or relayed to all of the participants for all of the panels. And those questions are, why do you think that text X or Y should or should not be within Judaism? What are the criteria for determining that a text is or is not within Judaism? What changes when a text is read within Judaism? And so today we are going to apply those questions to the Gospel of John. We will proceed in the order that is in the schedule posted on the webpage for this conference. The link is available in the chat box. And so without further ado, we begin with Jörg Frey. Welcome.
Thank you, Isaac, for the greetings and for hosting us. I have put something in the chat box for further reference, so I can now start. The debate over whether and how New Testament texts can and should be read within Judaism has also reached the Johannine writings. I have also written on these topics and will take the chance to explain my views briefly, especially also regarding the problems of the categories. I do not have to end the debate on the special presuppositions of the scholars promoting the Paul within Judaism trend, which I consider too ideological, but this does not affect so much the debate on the Johannine writings. Indeed, there is a lot of Jewishness in John. Not only the Jewish man Jesus, acting in Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and all the Jewish people around him, all characters except the Samaritans, Pilate, and the Roman soldiers, are Jewish. The narrative is structured around Jewish feasts. There are quotations from and allusions to the scripture throughout. There is the use of Jewish exegetical techniques and ultimately the claim that salvation is from the Jews. However, John can also appear the most anti-Jewish of the canonical Gospels. Only here the Judaioi are called the devil's offspring, and throughout the Gospel a rhetoric is used that leads readers to disaffiliate from those Judaioi and affiliate with a different group described as children of God. I largely agree with Adel Reinhardt on this topic. The history of reception confirms this. John has been used throughout history in a fatal manner, fueling anti-Jewish resentment and even anti-Semitism. Is John Jewish and anti-Jewish at the same time? How can the obvious tension between the Johannine tradition's fundamental Jewishness and the Gospel's harsh anti-Jewish polemics be explained? By the way, in the epistles that are closely related in my view, rather written before the Gospel than thereafter, and do not narrate the story from Jewish Palestine, there are no Judaioi at all. In the last third of the 20th century, scholars offered many considerations and explanations on this remarkable phenomenon. Notably, these issues were only discussed after the catastrophe of the Shoah, when theology and biblical scholarship had to acknowledge the roots of anti-Semitism within Christianity, even within their beloved canonical texts. Therefore, the search for John's Jewishness has often had moral overtones, as if that could undo what has happened. The question remains, would anything be different if John were Jewish, or if the Gospel could no longer be considered Jewish? I don't think so. Of course, I know we cannot avoid such moral overtones completely, but they are bad for scholarship and may lead to ideological distorted results. Many of the explanations given in recent decades have lost their force. Distinguishing terminology between Judeans and Jews, or limiting the meaning of the Judaioi to merely the Jerusalem authorities, are both philologically unconvincing, and they cannot neutralize the distancing effect of the Gospel's rhetoric. Historically, the so-called community hypothesis, influentially promoted by Louis Martin and Reverend Brown, in Germany by Klaus Wengst, has lost its plausibility. The assumption of an isolated, even sectarian community that developed from early Judeo-Christian views into a bold high Christology and later on anti-docetic stance cannot be confirmed by the sources, especially the redaction-critical stratification has lost plausibility. This does not mean that the most significant insight that John's anti-Jewish rhetoric stems not from the historical Jesus, but from later developments, is invalid. This critical insight is important to defend against all naive biblicism. However, the detailed reconstruction of theological developments, as in Brown's commentary or in Fortner's hypothesis, was largely science fiction. From a hermeneutical perspective, the optimism of earlier scholars who attempted to explain the polemics as a reflection of contemporary conflicts has proven to be too naive. Nor can historical explanation of the polemical tone as a reflection of the traumatic expulsion of the Johannine Jews from the synagogue rescue the text from the accusation of anti-Judaism. Therefore, it is odd when scholars try to determine which ideas or phrases of the gospel still emerged within Judaism before the split from the synagogue, as if this were a single, even datable event, and which ideas emerged larger from an outside perspective. Should we then accept only the earlier views of the lower Christology while dismissing the later ideas, including the high Christology, as a pagan distortion? Is calling Jesus as a prophet good, and John 14:6 anti-Jewish and to be dismissed? If the gospel is read as it was distributed, such distinctions become invalid. Readers perceive John's rhetoric as a whole. But now we must look at the categories within or outside of which Judaisms. The dual opposition of within and beyond or outside of is problematic. It implies the imagination of a clearly demarcated space of Judaism, comparable a city enclosed by walls, intramuros, extramuros. But this is anachronistic, because not only in the Second Temple period, but even later, even in the Rabbinic period, there was no instance or no institution in Judaism to make binding decisions about what was acceptable and or not, and who was in and who was out. Neither the law, nor the temple authorities, nor the Pharisees, or later the rabbis were in such a position. Instead, any interpretation decision was further debatable and malleable. Therefore, the entire within Judaism debate suffers, in my view, from an underestimation of the plurality of ancient Judaism and the malleability of identity and belonging. In fact, the criteria for deciding about who and what was Jewish or not were far from clear. And who are we scholars, Jewish or Christian scholars today, to decide upon that? All those criteria were malleable and negotiable throughout antiquity. This is even more true regarding texts. There was no clear-cut opposition, and many ancient texts, think of the life of the prophets, the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, the ascension of Isaiah, and so on, cannot be clearly assigned. What is often overlooked in these considerations are the hermeneutical issues involved. What would it mean if the gospel was still written as in an entirely Jewish context, or on the other hand, in a predominantly Gentile environment? And which were the consequences if it could be demonstrated that the addressees were still connected to a local synagogue, or conversely, that the community of addressees was mixed or even majority from a Gentile background? Why do scholars look for evidence to favor the within or the beyond? Does the attempt to read John within a Jewish context and as an inner Jewish debate help save it from the charge of anti-Judaism? Or is it intended to liberate the text from the constraints of a traditional Christian interpretation? Or should the option for a beyond secure Christian universality, or in general the Gospel's Christian character and theological importance? It is clear, grouping texts and defining their historical and religious interrelatedness is never neutral, but always linked with a position taken by the scholars themselves, with constructions of our own identity and belonging and claims of validity of textual or scholarly traditions. This hermeneutical circle is unavoidable wherever relevant texts and traditions are involved. We must be aware of this when reading Jewish and Christian texts in our own historical context, bearing in mind the dangers of their reception. But it would be naive to claim historical neutrality, because such a claim, although frequently made, is an illusion. But how can we then decide whether or not the fourth gospel is still Jewish? How can we find criteria that are not arbitrary and do not simply reflect the researcher's interests? There are numerous factors that have been considered in the discussion. The place and time of composition. Was John composed before 70 or rather late? Was it composed in Jewish Palestine, the reign of Agrippa II, or rather in the diaspora? In my view, all attempts at an early dating, including the book by Valentin Ravesi or now George van Goten, are problematic. John is later than the synoptics and from a diaspora background. The question is about the order of language or knowledge of Judaism, the use of the scriptures and other Jewish traditions, aspects of talking about God in contrast with pagan polytheism. Yes, I do agree. This is all Jewish. John 17:3, the one and only true God. I do think the author has a Jewish background, knows a lot, even some Aramaic, perhaps, and understands faith in Christ in a clear distance from paganism. The elements of a conduct in line with diaspora Judaism are to be mentioned, especially in the epistles in 3 John, that the missionaries do not take shelter from pagans. These are traces of diaspora Jewish conduct, behavior probably adopted or continued by some. Most important are the assumptions about the addressees and their world or the gospel's rhetoric. If John explains Jewish customs, if he lets Jesus speak about your law, as if we're not Jewish at all, this points to some distance. In particular, the mention of the Greeks coming to Jesus in John 12, possibly already the Samaritans in John 4, point to an audience including non-Jews. The sheep, not from this fold, and the dispersed children of God also point in this direction and cannot be limited to a reading merely in traditional context. We could add more aspects of interaction with Greek philosophy and religion, but this would go too far. In my view, there is evidence for assuming a mixed audience of some. Although the work adopts many aspects of Jewish tradition and diaspora Jewish life, the addressees of first readers likely included Christ followers from non-Jewish backgrounds in a predominantly pagan world. We should mention here the nearly complete absence of the term Judaioi in the farewell discourses, the prologue, and also the Johannine epistles. The mention of the Judaioi and also the conflict are limited to the story of Jesus and the contemporaries told in Jewish Palestine. I still assume a community of Jesus followers, although the community hypothesis has faded away. A community in which the gospel grew and was edited. I do not think these are merely literary processes. Here I disagree, for example, with James Barker's new book, but I do think the gospel also aims at a wider audience beyond a certain community. The hyperbolic closure in 21 points to a world of books. Is it a coincidence that around 110 CE the Celsus Library was built in Ephesus? At least John goes beyond a certain community and ultimately also points beyond Judaism. Therefore, I find Adel Reinhardt's argument compelling. The rhetoric distances readers from the Judaioi. In the world of Greco-Roman diaspora, this implies a distance from the local ethnos of the Judeans or Jews. Some of the addressees may still follow Jewish customs, and of course, there are still debates with Jews as did continue that did continue for centuries. But if there were any local separation, I hesitate to speak of an expulsion. It was in the past of the Gospel's composition. Neither the epistles nor the Gospel are edited or directed towards a solely or even predominantly Jewish audience. In 1 John, aspects of particularly Jewish practice play a very little role, if at all, and the Gospel seems to envision even a wider readership beyond the concrete circles where it was probably composed. I cannot go into the field of Christology. I'm currently writing an article on that. Again, there's a lot of messianic debates, terms and references adopted. As Boyarin and also Ruben Bühner have demonstrated, Messianism could even include divine figures. The Logos draws on wisdom tradition. But when the Logos is God, this may be strange for most contemporary Jews. And a God incarnate is alien to both biblical Jewish tradition as well as the Greco-Roman tradition. Yet when calling Jesus Savior of the world and Kyrios Kaitios, as Domitian was called by his cronies, this aims at resonances in the Hellenistic, even political world, and the title monogenes is also beyond anything in Judaism and close to other patterns. Only Athena is monogenes of her father Zeus. So, John is strongly Jewish and yet goes and aims beyond the, let's say, soft borders of Judaism. Not within, but beyond. Jewish and anti-Judaioi at the same time. This makes the text not worse, nor better, but our reading must avoid simple oppositions and be aware of the complexities of historical processes. This is scholarship. The other question of how to deal with these texts responsibly in church and society today is another question, not for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. And I'm happy you also brought some conversation about the Johannine epistles, because it was a consideration we had behind the scenes about what about the other Johannine literature. So we might have opportunity to discuss that as well during the time allotted for discussion. But we will transition immediately to Catherine Williams.
Well, thank you, and thanks, Isaac, and to Gabriele for the invitation to contribute to this panel, and to Megan for managing the technical side of things. Now, this, of course, is the second time for the Enoch seminar to focus specifically on the question of John within Judaism, and a number of core issues and methodological matters were subjected to wide-ranging discussion on that first occasion back in March 2023. Now, given that Isaac has this time invited panelists to concentrate, if they wish, on a particular element or aspect or topic, I've chosen to approach the question of reading John from within Judaism and to reflect on the opportunities and the challenges posed by the label within Judaism by focusing on one of the main of my own research interests within Johannine studies, which is the reception of the Jewish scriptures in the Gospel of John. Now, of course, this aspect is often highlighted in scholarship as a central facet of the Jewishness or Jewish character of John's Gospel. But as far as I know, John's wide-ranging engagement with Israel's scriptures has received only partial treatment to date, insofar as it relates to and can contribute to discussion of interpreting the gospel from a within Judaism perspective. Now, it's widely acknowledged that the Jewish scriptures play a pivotal role in John's shaping and retelling of the Jesus story, and that the authoritative status of scripture, graphe, is repeatedly underlined within the text. However, only in recent years has this acknowledgement translated into a growing recognition that the widespread, often creative use of scriptural citations, themes, and motifs in the Gospel of John is to be situated firmly within the broader context of not only knowledge of scripture, but of Jewish exegetical activity in the first century Judaism. Therefore, if we apply the label within Judaism to the task of investigating John's indebtedness to a range of Jewish interpretative techniques and practices, I think it can be claimed, undoubtedly, that John's Gospel is a significant participant in, even a valuable witness to, the richness and diversity of Jewish scriptural interpretation in the first century CE. Let me just cite one example, which I think is a significant one. Over half of the methodically signposted scriptural quotations in John take the form of a composite citation, where discrete words or phrases from other scriptural source texts are inserted into the primary source text to form a singular scriptural citation. In terms of the spectrum within of the writings, John falls very high in terms of usage of this kind of quotation compared to the letters of Paul, relatively speaking, and also the synoptic gospels. Now, in all such cases, the composite character of the quotation can be demonstrated to be the result of Johannine redaction, that is, rather than inherited tradition, because the composite material in question is in total alignment with the distinctive features of John's portrayal of Jesus, emphasis on, for example, his heavenly origins, divine foreknowledge, source of living water, and so forth. But what I think is also striking is that the fusion of composite material in John's quotations is invariably controlled by the bringing together of shared vocabulary, catchword links, and themes from the scriptural sources in question. Now, John's interpretative techniques are often compared in this respect to the Jewish exegetical device later described by the rabbis as Gezerah Sheva. But the closest analogues to John's composite method are to be found in earlier Jewish texts, such as the writings of Philo and the Dead Sea Scrolls, where once again, it is the presence of catchword links in scriptural sources that underpins their composite character. The meticulous reworking of scriptural quotations in John attests to the author's profound knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, of Israel's scriptures, but also to the work of a highly literate scriptural exegete. In fact, what is strongly indicated by the form and intricate workings of John's composite quotations is the author's commitment to ensuring that these quotations hold exegetical validity in Jewish terms, that is, by remaining within the boundaries of known practices of Jewish scriptural interpretation. Now, this may not prove that the author is ethnically Jewish, but it does point to the work of someone whose method of engagement with the scriptures belongs firmly within the orbit of what is acceptable and exegetically legitimate within Judaism. Where matters become more complex is when it comes to reading John, is the fact that the text's interpretative aims, in contrast to its methods, are radically different from what is attested in roughly contemporaneous Jewish texts. And this, of course, as Jörg has already intimated, because of its thoroughgoing Christological hermeneutic. The Johannine text seeks to maintain a fine balance between the ways in which it negotiates the authority of Scripture with the authority of Jesus as God's exclusive revealer. And it does so by working with two key hermeneutical principles. First, that Israel's scriptures repeatedly provide the backdrop or screen for the telling of the gospel narrative. But secondly, that Jesus is to be understood as the interpretative key to those scriptures. So in a far more comprehensive manner than what is encountered in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, or Luke, or in the letters of Paul, the Jewish scriptures, according to John, are actually about Jesus. Now, this principle is evident, of course, as you know, in the programmatic statement attributed to Philip in chapter 1:45. We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote. Whereas later in John 5, scriptural interpretation becomes the site of an intense clash in perspectives when the Johannine Jesus tells the Judaioi that the scriptures testify on his behalf and that they fail to understand the scriptures because the only appropriate response is to interpret them as witnesses to Jesus. Now, given moreover that scripture is not only said to be fulfilled, plero, but according to the 19th chapter, brought to its ultimate completion or goal, or as I've read in a recent book, perfection has been suggested, teleo, in the hour of Jesus' death. What does this disclose about John's understanding of scripture? Are those scriptures understood to have reached their all-encompassing conclusion, albeit without necessarily devaluing Israel's past, or claiming that scripture is now redundant? Or does the text's emphasis on the Johannine Jesus as the exclusive revealer of God diminish, that is, apart from just a few fleeting references, the salvific historical value of Israel's scriptures? There are some exceptions, but the general tone is of this focus, not on the past, but on the present. Now, more specifically, given the subject of today's session, how does John's thoroughly Christological understanding of the Jewish scriptures align with a within Judaism perspective? Where does one place such innovation on the part of John's scriptural interpretation? Even if it can be envisaged as reflecting or belonging to an intra-Jewish debate, it also stands apart due to the focus and scope of its Christocentric exclusivism from what is encountered in broadly contemporaneous Jewish texts. Now, admittedly, it does not necessarily follow that interpreting John's gospel from a within Judaism perspective is tantamount to claiming that the Johannine text must wholesale and comprehensively fall within Judaism. The task is not so much to sift through and determine which elements in John's text do and which do not work or fit entirely within a Jewish framework, Rather, its purpose is to explore questions of how, why, and also what happens when the Gospel of John is read within Judaism. Now, this is made abundantly clear by Wally Sirafesi in his 2022 monograph, and I suspect will be highlighted by Wally again today. But I am nevertheless reminded of discussions in previous Enoch seminar sessions about the usefulness or otherwise of the label or the category itself, evoking as it does a container-like paradigm with the implication that there are certain limits or boundaries as to what can be included within Judaism. So to conclude, many aspects of John's method of scriptural reference and citation can be confidently placed within a Jewish framework, just as the various facets of its high Christological portrait of Jesus fall quite comfortably within Jewish conceptions of divinity, as demonstrated in recent scholarship on Jewish notions of divine embodiment and on the role of divine intermediaries. Having said that, its wholly Christocentric interpretation of Israel's scriptures, with no incontrovertible analogues against which it can be compared, is among those elements, I would even say pressure points, whereby from the perspective of reading or positioning John within Judaism, something unprecedented is at play. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And yes, for also informing and reminding the audience that this is not the first time the Enoch Seminar has had a panel or a discussion on John within Judaism, as is the case also with Matthew and Luke. We've had some previous events, but we're revisiting this issue, among other things, in order to see how the discussion might fit within the broader discussion of all this, and there is in fact even the proceedings of one of the events of the Enoch seminar that Jörg Frey has showed there on the screen. We might put a link in the chat box for that. So it's really intriguing to see now how all of this fits into the broader picture of the early Christian mosaic that we're trying to explore during this conference. But without further ado, we're going to now go to Wally Sirafesi. Your name has already been mentioned twice in the discussion, so now you get to have your showtime.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate it, Isaac, and hello, everyone. It's very good to be with you today. I'm really thankful to have another opportunity to continue a conversation that's been going on really for several years now, specifically on this question of John within Judaism. So thanks again to Gabriele, Isaac, and then of course Megan as well for the invitation to contribute. And I also wanted to say thanks. I don't think she's here, but thanks to Adele Reinhartz for continuing to be a very charitable conversation partner on this topic, and most recently, just last month at the SNTS meeting in Regensburg. So just a shout out to her. Since I have produced and published a few things that document my approach to the topic already, I'd like to take these few minutes to talk really from a bird's eye view about some of the methodological issues and identify, at least from my perspective, some of the key points of agreement and disagreement in current discussion. So there might be a little bit of overlap with what I say here and Jörg's really fine presentation as well. I think there's a lot of shared sentiment that we have, so bear with me if there's some overlap. But to start here, at the center of the discussion of John within Judaism is perhaps, I think, as we're all recognizing here, somewhat unsurprisingly, the question of what is meant by the phrase within Judaism. The recent volume titled What Does Within Judaism Mean, edited by Karin Hedner-Zetterholm, my colleague in Lund, and Anders Runeson, explored this question in depth from a variety of angles. However, one of the challenges with the phrase is that it by nature appeals to our essentializing impulses and our desires to put matters into neat and tidy binaries, again, as has already been kind of explained. Is John within Judaism or not? Is John a Jewish text or not? These are questions that are predicated upon an essentialist definition of what both John and Judaism are, and then require us to think in these binaries concerning whether John is within or outside of something that we're calling Judaism. So while I think that the phrase can still be heuristically productive, and I think that's what Catherine was pointing at, and then Gabriele has also mentioned a couple of Enoch seminars ago, I would encourage us to start thinking about John and Judaism not as static and fixed essences that we need to somehow put in relationship to one another, but rather as elements within larger assemblages that involve texts, readers, things, affects, physical and cultural contexts, etc., which have historically been and continue to be in processes of being brought together, disassembled, and reassembled again. In other words, my answer to the question of whether John is within Judaism or not is increasingly becoming yes and no. That is, within some assemblages, yes, John has the potential to be read as a Jewish text or within Judaism. Yet within other assemblages, no, it can't. I'm sure we'll have some more opportunity to discuss that a little bit later. Second, while I think there's general agreement that Judaism, however we define that term, et cetera, was highly diverse in the worlds of late Second Temple and early rabbinic periods, there seems to be little agreement on what that extra textual point means or should mean for interpreting John's gospel. In my own work, I tend to mobilize this point, not because I think John intends to represent the real world of first century Roman Palestine with journalistic detail, but because it helps me make sense of John as a text that participates discursively in the ideologically congested world of Jewish antiquity. It helps me make sense of, for example, how Jewish institutions can be interpreted very differently and yet still be legible as an expression of Jewishness, or how two groups given the ethnonym Iudaios, and who both self-identify as being loyal to the Jewish God, can also engage in heated conflict. So in my work, the concept of John being within Judaism has been primarily about assessing John's strategies of negotiating Jewish identity and suggesting that that negotiation rests on the premise of the Johannine Jesus' self-identification with the Jewish ethnos and self-perceived fidelity to the Jewish God. In other words, John seems to think that it stands in continuity with Judaism, though of course it has its own preference for what that Judaism should look like. And I was just thinking now of Paul Sloan's comments with regard to the Luke Within Judaism session and this idea that perspectivity, right, or the perspectivalness of identity is really important here when we ask what would have theoretically John thought if we asked this question of does it stand in continuity with Judaism or not. One key point on which I think there is some agreement is that John's Jewish features or Jewish background neither equates nor immediately legitimizes a within Judaism reading of John. This also has already been brought up now a couple of times. This is especially the case if the Jewishness of John is a kind of appropriated or colonized Jewishness, which the text intends to apply to a kind of new Israel that has nothing to do with the Jewish ethnos, that is, with ethnic Jews. It's not enough simply to assert that John is engaged with Jewish scriptures, although Katrin has just presented a fantastic argument for that component. Or the Jerusalem Temple, or other Jewish traditions. Plenty of non-Jewish Christian writers were ideologically engaged with these institutions, and they were simultaneously also explicit in their anti-Jewish views. That God had rejected the Jewish people, that the Jews had killed Jesus and were therefore under divine judgment, and that Judaism was fundamentally incompatible with Christian identity. So a question that emerges here then, I think, is similar to the one that Matthew Novenson raised at the Enoch seminar two years ago that Ketchman referenced, about 2.5 years ago, and which I didn't actually have a chance to answer and engage with, but I think it's a really good question. The question is whether John's Jewish features operate on the level of later Gentile Christian supersessionist ideology, or if they rest on an identity orientation that distinguishes it from such Gentile expressions of anti-Jewishness. In my work, I've argued that passages like John 4:20-24, that's Jesus' engagement with the Samaritan woman, in which Jesus identifies with the Jewish ethnos, and John 11:45-52, in which the death of Jesus is said to somehow positively benefit the Jewish ethnos, seem to support this latter conclusion. That is, from John's vantage point, being a part of the Jewish ethnos continues to be soteriologically meaningful. Even for the few non-Jews in John's narrative world, being in the orbit of Jewishness seems to be a presupposed soteriological criterion upon which one's encounter with Jesus is based. The Greeks mentioned in John 7:35 and those who come to see Jesus in 12:20 are, before encountering Jesus, envisioned to be ethnic boundary crossers who are already participating in Jewish life. That is, they are Judaizers, or perhaps we should call them Garim or something like that. And John gives us no indication that their encounter with Jesus functions to turn them away from this Judaizing behavior. From John's perspective, fidelity to Jesus is predicated upon and stands in continuity with the writings of Moses. That's 145, 546 through 47. So that is within the ideological framework of Johannine exclusivism. While one can only come to the Father through Jesus, one can only come to Jesus through Moses. In the case of the Samaritan woman, the only non-Iudaios in John who had a historic claim to also being a true Israelite, she is both critiqued by Jesus for some perceived lack in her Samaritan identity and invited into a salvation that comes from the Iudaioi. That's 422. Worshipping Israel's God Jewishly does not seem to be an option for her. It's mandatory. In other words, the Johannine Jesus' idea of Israel, that's just sort of giving a nod to Jason Staples' book, is inclusive of non-Jews, Samaritans, and Greek Garim, but it is soteriologically mediated through Jewishness. It's at least my own reading of it. If John's Jewish features do not immediately place it within Judaism, which I think we're all kind of agreeing on, then I think it might be worth considering the converse. Does something like John's harsh criticism of the Iudaioi or its messianic exclusivism immediately place it outside of Judaism, however we're defining those boundaries? This question, of course, is a perennial one in Johannine studies, and it directly relates to other questions such as, is John's attitude towards Jewishness as a whole reducible to its instances of hostility towards the Iudaioi? Are John's Iudaioi meant to timelessly represent all Iudaioi everywhere? And how much meaning should we ascribe to John's non-use of the term Iudaioi for positive character groups, like Jesus' disciples? And this was a big issue that we talked about last month in Regensburg with Adele Reinhardt's. There appears to be little agreement on these questions, but how one answers them often betrays one's approach to the larger question of John and anti-Judaism, which, of course, Jörg did a great job of presenting and explicating for us. I've given my take on these questions in other venues, so I won't rehash them entirely here, but I do want to make two brief points about what a within Judaism approach, at least how I understand it, what it does and what it does not do as it relates to these particular questions. First, approaching the Johannine Jesus' conflict with the Iudaioi through a historical lens of intra-Jewish polemic, as I do, does not change the fact that the Johannine Jesus engages in hate speech, at least as it's defined in our modern-day context by the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech. John's use of the rhetoric of demonization, which is a rhetorical strategy of intra-group polemic that we see used throughout the ancient world, is part and parcel to its narrow and exclusive view of who's in and who's out. As both Jesus and the Iudaioi each associate the other with the realm of demons and devils, they each construct a view of their own as a view of their own group as constitutive of the whole. We are true Israel. We are the true seed of Abraham, etc. Forgive me. This type of exclusionary discourse, even if it's stemming from an... Pardon me for this. I've got a phone call going through. This type of exclusionary discourse, even if stemming from an intra-Jewish literary environment, doesn't, or at least it shouldn't, make contemporary readers of John feel any better or more comfortable with some of the attitudes of the Johannine Jesus towards the Iudaioi. Second, on the other hand, what a within Judaism approach does do, or at least what it does for me, is raise the question of whether the modern edict category of anti-Judaism is really the best way to describe analytically John's hostility to the Iudaioi and its exclusive ideology, if we are interested in understanding John within an assemblage of initial readers within the Second Temple period. The terminology of anti-Judaism is deeply ensconced in normative and normativizing discourses on the boundaries of Judaism and Christianity, both in antiquity and today. And this, for me, is really what's at stake in the John within Judaism type of project. It's not about getting John off the moral hook or having an ulterior apologetic agenda. Rather, it's about being interested in interrogating the normativizing impulses and categories that have fed for centuries the notion that John is and must be read as incompatible with Jewishness writ large. A within Judaism approach can create a hermeneutical rupture in those normativizing conceptual spaces for both Christians and Jews. And for me, this task of interrogating and rupturing our inherited categories is precisely what I think critical scholarship should be all about. Thanks a lot, and sorry again for these interruptions with the phone.
No problem. Thank you. In fact, you reminded me to put my phone on silent mode, which I had forgotten. Thank you, Wally, for that presentation. We're just going to go ahead and proceed to the next presenter, Hugo Mendez.
Hi, everyone. And thank you all for having me at this conference today. Very happy to speak to you all on this topic. So the question we are considering today is, can the framework we call John within Judaism be productive for the study of the Gospel of John? As I see it, that really depends on what we mean by the expression John within Judaism. This expression, like so many other scholars use, is fraught with potential ambiguities, a point that many panelists have raised over the past few days of this conference. Now, I can imagine at least one potentially productive use of the phrase. As I see it, the phrase John within Judaism could be a productive one if it trains scholars on the Gospel's profound indebtedness to Judaism, to Jewish scripture, to Hellenistic Jewish philosophy and theology in multiple dimensions. Many aspects of the Gospel of John, its literary form, its intertextual references, its Christology, its ethical vision, are only intelligible through a deep knowledge of such Jewish sources as Genesis, Isaiah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the writings of Philo, among so many others. And there is excellent research currently being done that develops this essential insight. I can cite, for example, Deborah Forger's superb forthcoming book on divine embodiment and sight in John. I can also point to the work of scholars such as Harold Attridge and my co-panelist Katrin Williams, who have linked John to Jewish interpretive frameworks. If John within Judaism is a call to recover the Jewish antecedents and matrices of the Gospel of John's thought, then the phrase, I think, can be a useful one. The difficulty is that John within Judaism, at least as historically defined by its proponents, has often connoted much more. So consider, for example, my co-panelist Wally Sirafessi's 2021 eponymous monograph, John within Judaism, what I would consider, quite to Wally's credit, the type specimen of recent John within Judaism research. On page 25 of that text, Sirafessi writes that what unites recent within Judaism approaches to the New Testament, including Matthew's Gospel, Paul's letters, and Revelation, is the aim to read these texts, quote, not simply against the background of Judaism or in light of their Jewish roots, but as Judaism and as Jewish texts. In this project, Sirafessi continues, one brings, quote, John's Gospel, already long appreciated for its Jewish background, to the scholarly table for a similar kind of reconceptualizing it as a Jewish text. Now, notice that in this quote, Sirafessi tells us that John's scholarship has actually never needed a within Judaism label to have its Jewish features appreciated. It has long been appreciated for its Jewish background. He also makes it clear, at least here, that the Within Judaism project is not really meant to highlight those connections. Instead, Sirafessi sees the label as part of a different project of reimagining John as a Jewish work penned by Jews and engaged in intra-Jewish debates about Jewish beliefs, practices, and identities. Now, I have watched Sirafessi nuance this framework over the years and in this presentation. I really appreciate it, Wally. And so I want to give him also an opportunity to transcend even that framework in our panel discussion that follows. But if I may, just as a scholar of John, I find this framework, if it is essential to what we would call John within Judaism research, problematic for various reasons. First, and I make this point in my most recent book, The Gospel of John, A New History, which is out with Oxford this year, I don't think that we can have any certainties about the ethnicity of John's author. I think the ethnicity of John's author has to remain an open question for our field. The author certainly presents himself as Jewish. He purports to be the nameless disciple whom Jesus loved, who has written these things. And we have every reason to think that the disciples of Jesus were all Jewish. Many reconstructions of the so-called Johannine community in the late 20th century took this datum and freely built more complex theories of the community's Jewish and Levantine origins from it. But there are many unknowns here. No doubt the most important, for me at the very least, is whether this figure even existed. Many scholars, among them Ismo Dunderberg, Harold Attridge, David Litwa, and myself, have argued that the disciple whom Jesus loved is probably not a historical figure, but a literary creation, the mask of the text's real author. If we do not know who the text's real author is, we cannot speak with certainty about his ethnicity. I, of course, have also questioned the larger construct of a Johannine community in various published works. Other arguments meant to support the idea that the author of John was Jewish, are less convincing to me as well. For example, some scholars have found it telling that John reflects a remarkable knowledge of the landscape and topography of Jerusalem. Granted, but here again we run into many unknowns. The author of John might not have been from the Levant. He might have been familiar with the topography of Jerusalem from his access to existing oral and written traditions about Jesus, his access to itineraries and maps that describe the region, or even his own other experience in the region. But even if he was from the Levant, we should remember that there were also many Gentiles living in the region, familiar with both Greek and Aramaic, as apparently is our author, not least in such settlements as Caesarea, Damascus, and parts of the Transjordan, etc. Similarly, many scholars have found it telling that John reflects a solid working knowledge of Jewish scriptures, Jewish feasts, and Jewish practices. And yet, as some of my fellow panelists have noted already, we know that many Gentile authors, even some hostile to Judaism, had access and leveraged some of the same knowledge. In short, as I see it, there is no unambiguous evidence that can definitively demonstrate that our author was ethnically Jewish. But more than that, I see other problems with seeing the gospel as a Jewish work engaged in an intra-Jewish discussion about Jewish beliefs, practices, and identities. For one, it seems obvious to me, and you already brought this up in our discussion, that the author's audience was partly, perhaps even primarily, composed of non-Jews. The author regularly glosses Jewish customs for his readers. He clarifies, for example, the burial customs of the Jews for his readers in 1940. I would argue that a work directed towards many Gentiles may not be our best candidate to be a text engaged in something we can call an intra-Jewish debate, strictly speaking. Secondly, the author never depicts his believing audience as persons who participate in the category of Judaism. On the contrary, it is striking to me that the author frequently, notoriously even, treats Jews and Judaism as an external other. The author speaks of the Jews, hoi Judaioi, en blanc, dozens of times, multiples more than the synoptics, but the gospel also presupposes a past break of connection and identity between these externalized Jews and Jewish believers. In John alone, Jesus predicts that his followers will be expelled from Jewish circles and find no place in Jewish synagogues, something that, of course, many of us in John studies think might be significant for reconstructing the context of this author. More importantly, the author consistently imbues the Jews with negative and unsympathetic characterizations. The author imagines somewhat ahistorically that the Jews developed organized agreements to harass those who believe in Jesus, even in Jesus' own lifetime. In the most troubling exchange of the gospel, John's Jesus casts a representative crowd of the Jews as children of the devil. And of course, another dimension of this otherizing of Judaism is the way that the gospel distances Jesus, and by extension its own outlook, from the most important touchstone of Jewish identity and antiquity, the Torah. Even though the author presupposes Jesus' Jewish extraction, He distances Jesus from the law. In John, Jesus refers to the Torah in the presence of Jews as your law, the same language the Gentile Pilate uses for the law in other passages, 1831. Jesus also speaks in distanced ways of their law in 1525. More to the point, certain episodes in the gospel seem to demonstrate, arguably, Jesus' independence from any claim of the Jewish law, as if he is truly above that law. One thinks especially of Jesus' provocative command to the paralyzed man to carry a burden on the Sabbath in 5:8. And of course, several scholars have also read an implicit supersessionism, possibly, in Jesus' rhetoric about the temple in chapter 2 and in his allusions to Jewish feasts in later chapters. None of this suggests an author staked in anything like a conventional debate over Jewish halakha, in my view. In short, I think we have every reason to think that far from claiming a stake in Judaism, the author of John may be charting a non-Jewish, post-Jewish course for a widely Gentile audience. In the face of so many unknowns, then, I believe we should be highly apprehensive about characterizing John as an insider Jewish text. And if this is the defining feature of what we would call the John Within Judaism project, and I'll leave that for all of us to discuss on the panel, then I think we should be apprehensive about using that scholarly label. As I conclude, I would also, of course, echo my fellow panelists in reminding our listeners that mislabeling John as a Jewish text is not really an abstract problem. It has real-world consequences. If the Gospel of John is not clearly an insider text, but we blithely characterize it as such, then we run the real risk of giving the text not merely an undeserved stake in Jewish tradition, but an illegitimate and problematic one. And of course, doing so can also muddle our ability to grapple with the text's most problematic features. We know that today more than one scholar downplays or even excuses the anti-Jewish rhetoric of this text on the grounds that this text cannot be anti-Jewish since it is supposedly of Jewish origin and an insider Jewish text. These are the challenges we face. These are the challenges we will no doubt continue to discuss on this panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Hugo. I think we're going to have a good time discussing some of the points that have been brought up here in the presentations. Let us move on to next presenter, Douglas Estes.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Gabriele and Isaac and the Enoch Seminar for allowing me to participate today. In the few minutes that I have, I want to focus on answering the first question of the three, partly in the hopes that by answering the first question, I'll also give some insight or some small degree answer the second and third questions. The story of John within Judaism. So why do I think that the fourth gospel should be read within Judaism, specifically Second Temple Judaism as we define that idea today? Because the Gospel of John is an ancient text created by a Jew, at least in most theories, which features a protagonist who is a Jew, primary antagonist, the high priest, who are Jews, and a key character who is modeled after a Jewish prophet. Furthermore, the audiences come into the text through a clear and unambiguous Jewish opening, by which I mean the allusion to Genesis 1, and proceeds to focus on Jewish beliefs, practices, places, and people, such as the temple, the synagogue, and being cast out of the synagogue, the Sabbath, the Passover, Abraham, Moses, David, Jewish history, Jewish exegesis, as Katrin so wonderfully pointed out, and much more. Most importantly, much of the discussion in this text is about God, not some abstract philosophical deity, nor a figure in a polytheistic pantheon, but the Jewish God, the I Am, whom the implied author of the text is desperate to tie to Jesus without saying the quiet part out loud. Even if we were to go the other way and label as many of these motifs as possible as Christian or something along those lines, at least half would still be Jewish. Altogether, there really is no escape from the Judaism of the gospel, at least on the surface. However, the Jewishness of John is conceptually uncomfortable for many audiences, and this is in part the fault of the gospel style. For example, while John's first couple of words point back to the Jewish creation myth, the narrator immediately introduces the Logos, a concept with potential Jewish antecedents, but much more rooted in Hellenistic culture. Immediately, audiences sense mixed signals coming from the narrator. Very soon after this, the narrator is back to Hebraic imagery and Isaianic, not Homeric, sense of glory. This tension between two worlds is felt throughout the gospel. I believe that modern audiences often exacerbate these tensions needlessly in their approach to John in ways that are also, though, no fault to the evangelist. I will now pick a fight over two issues, though there are more. First, the last 3 or 4 generations of Johannine scholars have leaned into the idea that the gospel was intended by its author for a small audience, probably sectarian in orientation. A small audience makes for a small gospel. The perceived conflicts in the gospel that are assumed to be in this community encourages a reading that gives extra weight to conflict. Once, I think it was at another Enoch seminar session, if I'm not mistaken, William Loader described the trauma of the Johannine community in graphic detail that he believes that the group was going through. But the more that we presume conflict, the more conflict we can find. With these glasses on, we are alerted to every potential sign of a split, perhaps without the perspective of the general messiness of group dynamics that always exists in human relationships. There are, however, in my mind, a number of significant weaknesses with the idea that the creator of the gospel intended it only for a small group of people. Consider just the epilogue. It is an aftermath that is brimming with hope. After a night of fishing, the warm light of the rising sun sees the disciples make an astonishing catch of fish and enjoy a nice breakfast by the sea. This is followed by a stroll along the seashore where the narrator records 2 interactions. Jesus challenges Peter to feed Jesus' sheep, not his belly, albeit with a prophecy of his death. And then Jesus teases Peter about John's ministry, demonstrated in an emphatic question in 21:23. The narrator ends his story with a blast of hyperbole, a paradox that is meant to leave the audience in awe of all that Jesus did and will do. That doesn't sound like the story is meant for a small group of people in conflict. In fact, if there is an Eeyore among the Gospels, a community in conflict, it's Mark's Gospel and the Church from Rome, perhaps. The 4th Gospel sounds like a message for whoever will listen. Second, there are other parts of the Gospel where modern audiences perceive of conflicts and opposition where there is perhaps little or none. From the very beginning of the Gospel, modern readers are taught that John is dualistic, that there are strong oppositions at play just under the surface. I once wrote this: the metaphysical framework from which the 4th Gospel tells its story of Jesus is often curious to the modern reader, as it contains strong contrasts between light and darkness, heaven and earth, the Father and the world, as well as bold propositions about insiders and outsiders, truth and falsehood, life and death. These contrasts, according to many scholars, suggest that John's Gospel is inherently dualistic. Thus, the Gospel has a worldview that is shaped by dualism, and the Gospel employs a number of binary oppositions in a variety of ways to make its theological case. These perceived oppositions are not merely motifs that are explicit in the text, but they also seep into our interpretations of John, setting up the Jewish and Christian contrast: light, darkness, Jewish, Christian. Believing John is dualistic or contains dualism, in my opinion, taints all of these readings. The Gospel of John is not dualistic. Johann Gottfried Herder was wrong that John's dualism reflected an Oriental or Persian background, even as Ferdinand Barr and Adolf Hilgenfeld were wrong that John's dualism was derived from Gnosticism. Irenaeus would not have decried dualism so vociferously if John was dualistic. But let's just listen to the narrator himself. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. 1:5. Darkness cannot and shall not defeat light. It's not in its nature. The creator of John's Gospel is a friend to riddles and paradoxes. He uses them constantly. We could take a cue from the narrator and not read Judaism and Christianity as two forces locked in some eternal struggle. Instead, the relationship between Judaism and Christianity as they relate to John is paradoxical. Here's the definition I worked out for paradox. A paradox is a group of related propositions that, considered alone, are valid, but when considered together, contains one proposition that is at odds with the others, and as a result creates a seemingly true but uncomfortable solution for the group. Are there ideas in John that reflect Second Temple Judaism? Yes. Are there ideas in John that reflect nascent Christianity? Yes. Each of these propositions are valid, and when mixed together and applied to the Gospel of John, creates a true but uncomfortable solution for the group. These are but two evidences that support the argument that John is within Judaism, generally understood. Other evidences, such as the assumptions scholars make of universal Judaism, or especially the narrative construction of the gospel, things that I've mentioned at past meetings of the Enoch Seminar or in publications. Us biblical scholars swimming in theories of conflict and opposition have attuned ourselves to question some which is obvious. So let's end on a Johannine note. Famously, the narrator lets the beloved disciple speak at the very end of the story, saying, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." 21:24. Though the Gospel of John situates itself within Judaism, it is not a story about Judaism or Christianity. Rather, it is a story of a disciple who just wants to share what he saw as a Jew walking the paths of Judea with Jesus the Jew during the final age of Second Temple Judaism, remembering an epic past that will never be again. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. All right, so there's a lot I can see here to think about with the presentations that have been made. We will proceed to the final presenter, Laura Hunt.
Thank you. And thank you to Gabriella, to Isaac, and to Megan for all of your hard work and for inviting me. I am honored to be part of this panel. For my turn, I just want to present a few words on some of my current thinking, which, as I've listened to all of you, I think will fit well within Judaism debates at the Enoch Seminar. On Monday, there was a discussion, one of many that I've enjoyed listening to at Enoch seminars, about whether within is really the best preposition to describe what we're talking about with regards to the New Testament and Judaism, and that has already been brought up again today. At that point, Gabriele Boccaccini mentioned that he likes to think of the New Testament as being part of a Jewish conversation. And yesterday, I was at least convicted and perhaps convinced by Paul Sloan's discussion about the roots of the within Judaism label within Paul within Judaism, which is somewhat problematically for us a set of conclusions rather than a methodology. At the same time, the lively discussions in this seminar demonstrate, as Gabriella regularly reminds us, of the heuristic value of the within Judaism title for a seminar. I'd like to build on these thoughts regarding the Gospel of John. In my doctoral research, I was looking for evidence of the use of Latin in the Eastern Roman Empire and its possible connections to the Gospel of John. I looked in Ephesus, in Antioch, and in Alexandria, and I found evidence of the use of Latin in all three, particularly in cultural spaces connected with the army, with imperial law and administration, and with commerce. It was most abundant in Ephesus, but it was not absent from the other two cities. So although that research did not result in any firm conclusions about the social location of the author of the fourth gospel, it was enough to allow me to situate the Romanness of the trial narrative in some physical location that included an awareness of the Romans and their language and their practices. However, and despite being unable to prove anything about it, I find Ephesus to be a good place to theorize from. Throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, an association for Roman citizens existed in Ephesus, started in 29 BCE by Augustus. Ephesus was a center for the imperial administration of laws and taxes. Additionally, however, Samaritan Israelites left evidence on Delos, about 200 kilometers from Ephesus, from the early 2nd century BCE, and early in the 2nd century CE, there is evidence of Samaritans in Ephesus itself, on a monument erected by two representatives of Neapolis in Samaria, calling a former governor savior and benefactor. More recently, I've been looking at the use of the word pneuma outside of what we might perhaps call Jewish texts. And along the way, I discovered Rufus of Ephesus, a famous Greek physician who lived there during the late 1st and early 2nd century. This is my ongoing focus at the moment, so it's not finished yet. Although he left us few writings, they are not non-existent. They do mainly focus on treatment, but he did think that pneuma was a vital part of health, as many ancient physicians did, and that changes in diet could improve it. Evidence for Ephesian Jews comes from several centuries before the Common Era, in texts that record their consistent application to Roman rulers for recognition of their traditional rights, such as the right to avoid military service and the right to support the temple in Jerusalem. So Josephus also records Jews from Asia Minor who petitioned in Ephesus for a continuation of the rights and privileges granted to them by Augustus and Agrippa. It's worth noting that he does not refer to the Jews of Ephesus, but to the Jews of Asia, suggesting that, as with the Samaritans, the Jews around Ephesus were not necessarily local to one spot, but rather part of a larger interconnected network. A few inscriptions from the 2nd century CE show that by then at least some Judeans were integrated into urban Ephesus. And Luke, of course, reports in Acts 19, 1-7, that there were perhaps Jewish followers of John the Baptist, whom Paul baptized to become followers of Jesus. So I am theorizing then an extended network of interrelating, well-defined audiences, including also Jews who believed in Jesus Messiah. All of this brings me to Alan Bell and Penelope Eckert. Bell theorized that when people speak to an audience, they are influenced by many people around them. There are the people you intended to speak to, the people who show up unexpectedly, towards whom you pitch part of your speech, and people who show up unexpectedly whom you wish weren't there, and for whom you may change some words to blur what you mean for them. Bell also notes the importance of what he calls referees, pointing out that the location in which you give your speech will have an effect on your style, that the places that you mention will have an effect as well, and the topics too influence language. I could be having a casual conversation with a casual acquaintance, but if they ask me about my academic work, I may find that my Doktormutter is suddenly in my head, and I'm pitching what I say towards what I imagine she would approve of. Now note that this effect has nothing to do with her. It's purely a construction of my own brain and what I imagine she might say. Penelope Eckert has extended these theories into identity, something that I'm still investigating as well, looking for connections with intergroup and subgroup identities, as discussed in Tashfel and Turner's social identity theory. The difficulty with audience and referee design is that the only way to determine convergence or divergence of style is to compare what the author says with the language of those people or communities that one wants to argue convergence or divergence to or from. And of course, it's not the same to say that such language existed as it is to say that the author was influenced by it, and divergence would be even harder to show. This leads me to one other concept that I found helpful, which is the possibility of Haftpunkte in the text. Stefan Alkier posited the existence of Haftpunkte, words that are attached to a certain cultural context that one sprinkles at the beginning of a new section of one's writing in order to signal to the intended audience a switch in topic, or a switch in what Umberto Eco calls an encyclopedia. For the trial narrative, I argued that the Haftpunkte were the repetition of a calque of the Latin word praetorium. One of the things that I'm thinking about at the moment, though, is whether there's any evidence that a switch in audience or referee design requires Haftpunkte. I'm not sure that it does, although perhaps the switch itself might leave traces. In any case, to come back to Gabriella Boccaccini and the idea of a Jewish conversation, I'm thinking also about the history of scholarship in the Gospel of John and previous theories about its embeddedness in Mandean or Hellenistic or Gnostic or Qumran or Jewish cultural patterns. Of course, we now reject some of those connections that we have noted are anachronistic, but the fact that respected scholars could make those arguments demonstrates that just because similarities in vocabulary or style exist, that does not prove audience design or cultural influence. Still, I tend to doubt that those theories would have been possible if the gospel didn't have convergences with some of those milieux. So perhaps I might best describe my thinking about John as a conductor of an orchestral text, in which he taps on the music stand and then, waving his baton, brings in a Jesus for the followers of John the Baptist. And then, with a wave in a different direction, a Jesus for those interested in the place of the pneuma. And then a Jesus for Israel, as Katrin has shown us this morning, using the Jewish scriptures, and a Jesus for the Romans. In that case, the fourth gospel is within Judaism in the sense that the author draws from the Tanakh. And here I might mention Isaac's mention of Daniel Boyarin's thought exercise about how we would categorize these texts if Christianity was no longer a religion today, but only represented by the text as we found in a cave. So I don't think there's any question that the fourth gospel would be categorized as within Judaism. But perhaps better, at least in my theorizations, it's a Jewish conversation with the various people of an Ephesian world. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that presentation. So we've gone through all of the rounds of presentations now, and we have time for discussion. That was intended, of course. Maybe what we can do first is allow for any of the panelists, they have gut reactions or things they want to say immediately to one another. The opportunity is now provided for that. There are, of course, many things that I've jotted down in my Scribo notes, some issues, questions that we can return to. I'll just mention some in passing before I open the mics for everyone else. I'm thinking intra-Judaism, if we're talking about within Judaism, that was a point. What does that mean? Is this an intra-Jewish debate by placing John within that context? The heuristic promise, I think, of this nomenclature was brought up in the discussion, and that's one of the goals of this conference, of course. There are other things, of course, related to dating, to the location that I think are relevant for the discussion on John within Judaism. But before we discuss those firsthand, we can have some immediate reactions or responses from the panelists. Jörg, yes, please.
Well, yes, thank you for all the fine papers and all the points made. I think I want to emphasize one point from Vali's presentation. I think it's important that our discussion is not an essentialist one, but we are talking of perspectives. I wanted to make this point also from the hermeneutical perspective. We are all in some way engaging with things also with our modern situation in mind and the use of text in mind and all things. So it's a perspectivist debate of closeness and distancing, relatedness, appropriation, distancing, and I think this should make up the categories we are discussing and not the point of fixed boundaries that would not be in accord with the diversity and the negotiation in the ancient world.
Thanks for that important point. And going to next person has a hand raised. Wally, yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I also just wanted to say thanks to all the presenters. Excellent, very thought-provoking, of course, as well. Perhaps expectedly, I'd like to come over to Hugo for some of your comments. Thanks so much for the engagement. Really, maybe it's just some comments for clarification, really, is what it is. So you spent a bit of time talking about the issue of discerning the ethnicity of John's authors, authorial communities, whatever. And I actually completely agree with you. I've never suggested that we can pin down the author of the Gospel of John as a Jewish person, and therefore we should read the Gospel as a Jewish text or within Judaism. So I completely agree with you. And then what I would do is extend those comments, though, and those insights into also the question of audience. I'm not convinced that we have that much to go on in terms of John's audience market. I mean, I think. Of course, there have been some recent arguments. Adele has done this. some others have, I think even Jörg, you're maybe perhaps going the direction of seeing more of a Gentile audience. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Jörg, on that. But I mean, but even that, and we have very little to go on based on the text itself, right? I mean, we've got the two potential mentions of the Greeks, right, in 735 and 1220. We've got the engagement with the Samaritan woman in John 4, and that's kind of like that's it, right? So I would suggest that we take what I would call a sort of a historical minimalist approach to some of these more traditional questions about authorship and an audience. Even provenance is also part of this, and try to do the best we can to think about how John is configuring a text that makes sense within various kinds of potential readings, right? So anyways, I think there's more agreement between me and Hugo on those questions than disagreement. The last thing I would say, you mentioned just kind of briefly, Hugo, about the issue of the expulsion passages or the synagogues, right? And the potential separations that may have been reflected in John's textual world. And I would suggest that, when we talk about synagogues, we need to be very careful about what we're talking about, right? So when we talk about the synagogue, for example, as sort of a metaphor for Judaism, and sometimes that can be an explicit thing that we're doing or an implicit thing that we're doing. And I would really hesitate and push back against any kind of metaphorizing of the synagogue as representative of Jews, Judaism, that kind of thing. And therefore, if Johann and Christ confessors are being put on the outside of it, therefore they're being put on the outside of Judaism. And I think I can point you to an article that I wrote for JBL in 2023 that would kind of engage with that. This is the last thing, is no doubt, I don't think anybody doubts, right, that the overwhelming majority of John's engagement and presentation with Eudaio are negative, right? They're negative. There's a rhetorical element to this, call it disaffiliation, whatever. But there are some really important instances, particularly in John 11, and this is where I engaged a bit with Adele in Regensburg over there. John 11 has some really positive presentations of Eudaio as well. They're presented as believing. They engage with Jesus as kurios, right? There are these kinds of there's another part of John's portrait that we need to figure out what to do with, right? I mean, sure, the overwhelming majority is negative and hostile, but what do we do with these other these other elements of the presentation that are not necessarily hostile? Do we just kind of shove them to the side and say, well, that's just sort of an exception to the rule, or does it mean something within John's textual and rhetorical universe? So I'm not so I don't disagree that John is anti-Eudaioite in general, but there are some who are obviously don't fit that category. So in any case, thanks again for the engagement, and I can stop here.
No worries. Yeah, take your time. Don't feel rushed. And we can even, have a parallel dialogue going back and forth here. I know there are other hands here. I mean, Ugo, if you want to immediately respond, you may, you don't have to. We can come back to this. I'll let you take a deep breath and maybe reflect on what was just said. Katrin, you had your hand raised. I'll go to you next.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to pick up on some of the issues that Wally's just highlighted, and also triggered by some of the observations made by Douglas and also by Laura. Thinking about Hugo specifically about, do the explanatory comments necessarily point to a predominantly Gentile audience? I think it could be that there might be knowledge or an envisaged, even a minority group of Gentiles that would be on the horizon in order to be able to tap into kind of these prompts. It doesn't necessarily, I don't think, and I say that as somebody bilingual who, even if we are in a group of Welsh speakers and there's just one English speaker, then the whole conversation changes, yes, because of, now that's not a very good comparison, but what I'm saying is that if you are aware as an author that this is a text you want to take out to Gentiles, or that there is a text that will be read by some Gentiles, then those kind of comments would be included in it. So I just wanted to make that point. But also in terms of what's been coming up in the chat, and in terms of this, what I see as this very strong kind of framework of engagement with Jewish texts and Jewish scriptures and tradition, starting with En Arche in 1:1, and then going all the way through, even into John 20, with the new creation language and so forth. What kind of Gentile audience would be interested in that kind of vista, what in that kind of and I ask that not because I have the answer, because I'd really like to know some views about what kind of Gentiles are we envisaging here, in terms of people who are interested in Jewish tradition, people who have been attracted to it in a serious way. So that's probably why I agree with you that we can't gauge the ethnicity of the author or the audience, but that there is this focus on Jewishness, even if it's not within Judaism, that suggests more than an interest, a peripheral interest, shall I say it like that? Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I brought up in the chat, maybe I'll just vocalize it on the ethnicity of the author. Of course, what we cannot show, we cannot know, or we do not know, as Jacob Neusner would say in his book on the New Testament and rabbinic literature. But in thinking of both the presentations of Hugo Mendes, maybe also Douglas Estie's presentation, Douglas, in your presentation, you start out mentioning it speaks of a Jewish God, right? It speaks about the Jews. I'm throwing this out here. If it speaks about Jews, if it looks like Jews, if it's talking about a Jewish God, maybe the author is a Jew. Of course, that is not something we can ultimately prove, but this ties into the question of the hermeneutical promise. What is the hermeneutical promise of entertaining the possibility that the author can be Jewish? I'll only say, not in my own experience with other texts like Luke or Matthew and Acts, I've seen great hermeneutical promise there. If we start with the premise that the author is Jewish, then suddenly some texts that have been for a long time dismissed as like, Luke talks more than any other author about the Sabbath. 4 Sabbath controversies, not even mentioned in Acts. That's not important. These are matters no longer of interest to the author because the author is a Gentile and is writing to a Gentile Christian audience, predominantly, so at least. If we start with a different premise, we might look at these texts differently. There I see great hermeneutical promise. And I don't know if any of those comments are relevant here for our discussion of John, but I'm just throwing that out there in response to some of the discussions we're having right now about the author's identity. Douglas.
Yes, thanks, Isaac. I not sure if people can see the chat, but I would go and the other way, in a sense, and present the counterfactual argument. What if the author was a Roman biographer who just happened to think that, right, he wanted to be Plutarch or whatever, and how would that then reflect? Because then it would feel like a forgery. It'd feel very fake. It'd be John about Judaism rather than John within Judaism. I don't even know that we would fully have the same conversation at all. So that's why I think, I feel comfortable starting with mentioning the ethnicity of the author, because I think the preponderance of evidence points to the fact that he is in a Jewish milieu.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd be really interested to seriously take that thought experiment that you're proposing. Let's see if he's a Roman, even pagan author. Well, I don't know how far we could go with that experiment. Quite honestly, that's my first gut reaction. But thanks for sharing that, Wally.
Yeah, just a quick point. So even though I just mentioned a few minutes ago about my sort of historical minimalist approach with trying not to focus on the ethnicity of the author, I should say that just last year was published a book by Nathan Teal, and it's probably so I don't agree with everything that Nathan writes, but it is probably the most recent and most extensive sort of a defense of being able to establish the Jewish ethnic identity of the author. So he understands the debates, he understands the critiques of such a project, but he does it anyways and does it with I think a real sophistication that should be taken seriously. So if you're interested in kind of getting up on to snuff on some of these debates specifically about the Jewish/Judean authorship of John, then maybe read his book.
Thank you for pointing that out. Maybe you could provide the link in the chat box if you
Yeah.
have that information at some point readily available. We'll go to Jörg.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make 2 points. One maybe from my own work on Judeo-Christian Gospels, Jewish Christian Gospel tradition, and so on. And there has been always the discussion, how can we define what is Jewish Christian? What is Jewish then? What makes the Judaic character? And of course, the question is always not only the ethnicity, but is it related to a kind of Jewish practice, to a kind of halachic practice, and so on? And can we see in the text a kind of relatedness to certain, let's say, local communities, and this defines then kind of Judeo-Christianity or so. James Carlton Paget and others did so. So I think the question whether there is a kind of practice, halachic practice, and still in the background or still envisaged is one important point when discussing things. And the second point I want to bring up, I did some work on that. What does the Fiscus Judaicus mean for affiliating with Jewish groups in the Roman Empire after the year 70 or after then when it was imposed on the Jews? I think this makes, we had in the JET the discussion, what does it mean to God-fearers and to proselytes and so on, also to apostates. The Fiscus Judaicus made a kind of decision necessary, who pays the tax and who has not to pay the tax, which was before that membership in local Jewish ethnos or communities or synagogues, as you call it, was their own decision, and now it got a kind of Roman imperial registration and state affair in some way. So I think this made or triggered in some way decisions who belongs to what. And I think we should also consider these elements, these political, social political elements in the background.
Yeah, thanks. And there's Marius Hemstra, right, who has written an important monograph. I'm thinking of that work. Wally wants to join in this point, perhaps. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about Maurice's work here, Jörg. So really, Jörg, this is actually a question, a genuine question to you, because I struggle with knowing how to apply and kind of work with the Fiscus Judaicus in relationship to this issue. I mean, to my understanding, the tax would have perhaps discouraged Gentiles who are perhaps associated with Jewish communities, or Judaizing Gentiles that were attending synagogues and these kinds of things, to withdraw. Okay, I don't want to pay the tax, so I need to get out of here. But would it have necessarily separated Jesus-believing Jews from the Jewish community? So, like, what would it have done within the Jewish community? And then how would that relate to John? Right? I guess is the question, because John doesn't seem to. I mean, maybe it would have an impact on how we read the Greeks in 735 and 1220, but I don't know what you think about that.
If I just may answer on that, I think Jesus-believing Jews would have had the possibility, of course, to pay the tax, to stay with the synagogue. But Jesus believers from a Gentile background who had never been Jews before probably would not have been willing to pay the tax and to subscribe. So there is a kind of trigger for decision for the various groups we have in between the emerging Christianity and emerging synagogue.
Yeah, it's making me think that the Fiscus Judaicus may have had an impact differently depending on the composition of the local communities. This is reminding me of Anthony Saldarini in his book on Matthew, treating, I think it was the text, chapter 17 there somewhere, the passage dealing with paying the temple tax as if we read it as a post-70 text, then this is actually now the collection for the Fiscus Judaicus, and read it in a way that I find attractive, that actually the Gospel of Matthew is saying, yeah, we have to pay this, because presumably if you follow Saldarini's thesis, at least, the audience is composed of ethnic Jews, if I can put it that way. And so they were contributing, not because they were eager to do so, but that's what the authorities were requiring, and they were still identifying as Jewish. So maybe depending on the milieu, this Fiscus Judaicus would have had an impact in different ways. Gabriele, you've had your hand raised for a while, so you're co-chair, co-organizer. Please go ahead and say what you'd like to.
I think we should not be felt forced to decide whether John is within Judaism or outside Judaism. In my opinion, we have a text that has very good argument to both sides. Okay, very good argument both sides, and maybe we need a different kind of language. I mean, instead of in or out, inside, outside, because we are describing a sort of transitional moment in the development of Christianity. So probably the thing that I learned from this discussion is mostly that we should not limit ourselves simply to the binary decision if it's in or out. Okay, because maybe there is something in between. Okay, the author might be a Gentile, but certainly is an author that is completely embedded in the religion of Israel. And he's not simply writing about Judaism, he's writing a Jewish text, because I mean, the categories that he used are Jewish categories. The kind of ideas that he developed are from the biblical and the Jewish tradition. The audience might be Gentile, but these are Gentiles that are familiar with the tradition. They don't have to be explained about idolatry, about, I don't know why there is one God instead of many, etc. I mean, these are asked to jump immediately to a debate within Judaism, a debate that existed in Second Temple Judaism. So I don't know this very skilled Gentiles were that were ready from the very first sentence just to jump into a very sophisticated Jewish debate about messianism, about the eschatology, the protology, the origin of evil, etc., etc. So I mean, if you compare with the awkward attempt that Paul made at the Areopagus, I mean, it's completely, I mean, it's not the same thing. And it's also very different from the apologies that Justin Martyr will write in the mid-second century, where he knows exactly all the problems that Gentiles that are not familiar with the Jewish tradition have in approaching this kind of tradition. So once again, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I remember when we first for Reno seminar in 2019, we had a meeting in San Diego. No, I remember that, and then even before in Camaldoli, etc. I suggested that we should probably regard John as a form of radical Jewish sectarianism. In any case, it was an attempt to find something else different from being in or out, or outside or inside, to describe the particular position of the Gospel of John, which is at the same time a Jewish text, at the same time there are many anti-Jewish elements in the Gospel of John. But at the core is a text that is a piece of Jewish theology. I mean, is built, constructed entirely on on Jewish category. It's true that this could be said for all Christian texts, even in later times. But again, we have the problem again of these ways that never parted because Christianity never completely separated from Judaism. At the same time, we have already evidence in John that the ways had parted with some other Jewish groups of the time.
Just building on that with the terminology, right, within Judaism. And I want to also acknowledge some of the comments that are in the chat box. I think there's one about, yes, from Dennis Lutero why aren't we using the term Israelite instead? This is something that came up yesterday as well. And I'm thinking here with respect to that, the works of Cynthia Baker, who wrote the book Jew for the Keyword series by Rutgers Press, and Daniel Boyarin wrote in that same series on Judaism. I mean, these are two terms that rarely appear in Jewish literature, if we're excluding the Christian documentation. In rabbinic literature, classical rabbinic literature at least, Israel is used a lot more, and very often that's missed in English translations because they'll go, and I've seen this, they'll translate it as Jew, but no, it says Israel. So why are we using Judaism, Jewish so much when the Jewish literature from the time, right, is not doing that? What's going on here?
You want my answer?
I mean, anybody's answer.
Isaac is no. It's because these are the terms we use today, even though we know very well that these terms were used very rarely in antiquity, and they were used in a completely different way in which we are used today. So for us, Judaism or within Judaism means something that it was not the same that would have meant in the first century.
Okay, yeah. I mean, with John, I think this is kind of apropos because it uses a lot the term Judaios, obviously, Judaioi, and we have the passage that Wally highlighted in John 4:22, the Samaritans, who are Israelites in their eyes, at least, and the Jews, the Judaioi there. So this is, I think, very apropos. Jorg, in response to what I've asked, what would you like to say?
Well, in the time when the scholarly terms were coined, we had not yet the Qumran corpus. So the scholarship followed Josephus and Philo, and the Greek texts available at that time. And of course, there the term Judaioi and Judaios is of course widely used. Maybe in view of the Qumran corpus, that could be distinguished in some way, or we could go back to Israelite at some point. But I think that's also an effect of the history of scholarship or the history of the available of sources at a certain time.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I guess maybe behind my mind, does within Judaism or as Jewish make for a more provocative title for a for a conference or a book? Speaking as a culprit here, right, who has at least one book titled as Jewish, reading as Jewish in there. Is this partly a marketing stunt, or is there something more here? You know, it's tied to the hermeneutical promise, at least in conversations when I talk with, let's say, beyond the confinements of academia with fellow Jewish friends. Like, well, no, actually, what the Gospel of John is saying here about the Christology of Jesus is quite Jewish for his time. They're like, what do you mean, right? Or on the other hand, with friends of Christian affiliation. Well, actually, you know, in some of these texts in the New Testament, believe it or not, there might be an affirmation of Torah observance more than you think. So there is some, at least, hermeneutical promise in the sense of challenging, right, some conventional ideas and thinking about revisiting these texts. And I'm wondering whether within Judaism or Jewish serves that purpose better than Israel, right? If I put Israel in the title, Matthew and Israel, maybe that won't be as catchy or provocative a title. So that's just me babbling, thinking out loud there. Wally, I do see you had your virtual hand raised and was wanting to respond to this issue, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks, Isaac, for all of those comments. So I had something I wanted to say about the Israel versus Jews or Judaism thing, but then you started talking about is like within Judaism potentially a marketing ploy for a book. And as having written a book called John Within Judaism, I had to say, it's part of it. It is. I mean, titles communicate, right? They communicate, and I certainly was very intentional with the title to sort of get the book to participate in a larger discussion about, even what's happening over in, with our Pauline colleagues and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of both and there. I was going to say, so I think some of Jason Staples' work is important to kind of bring in to this, some of his most recent work in the idea of Israel. I don't know if Jason's in the participant room or whatever. He can chime in, I guess. Um, but I think one of the points that he makes, in his book, and I think it's particularly with reference to Paul. So I want to kind of respect the differences there. But one of the things he says is that when Paul uses the term Israel, he doesn't necessarily mean Jews, right? And so then that's an assumption a lot, I think, from some pretty prominent Pauline scholars that when Paul talks about Jews, he means Israel, right? Or vice versa, that they're just synonymous terms. And I think Jason is trying to draw some distinctions between the two. And I would suggest that we draw a distinction also when it comes to John, that when John uses the term Israel, which he does, or it does, he's not referring necessarily to Jews, and vice versa. When he talks about Jews, he's not necessarily referring to all Israel. So when John uses Israel, he doesn't necessarily mean Jews. This came up at SNTS as well, that it was noted that part of the reason why John might be so anti Eudioi might be because he's so pro Samaritans, right? Or Samaritoi, whatever the Greek term is. So John's vision of a larger Israel, right, that encompasses historic all Israel would of course include Judeans, Jews, but also extends to what the Northern Kingdom would be, encompassing Samaritans. So I think in response to Dennis's comment, Dennis Latoro's comment, I am starting to think a bit more about maybe we should talk about John within Israel, right, rather than John within Judaism. This is, I think, very similar to some of Daniel Boyarin's earlier work. I think his 2002 chapter or article, where he's, I think, pushing towards this, right? That there's sort of what's happening is that John's navigating different Israelite communities. And of course, one of those communities is the Eudioi, right? And there's some historical conditionedness to that. I don't know. I mean, we need to think maybe through that a little bit more, but I think that does some things for me that maybe just a strict John within Judaism, Jews and Judaism means Israel, doesn't do.
Thanks for that. I mean, Jörg, do you still have your hand raised?
Yes, that's another just a side comment on your question. What terms are provocative and maybe a sales point? Also, we are all now scholars from North America and Europe. We are all white scholars. In our context, in the American context, also in the European history, of course, Judaism, Jews play a role. Just a side remark, one of my doctoral students, a Korean, just could tell me, well, Jews, Judaism, no relevance for us. We had never Jews in our country. We have no sentiments. That is not important for us. And I just realized it's our history and our responsibility, feeling of responsibility, that makes terms important for us or provocative for us or a sales point for us, just as a side remark on Isaac's question.
Thanks for that. While we're at it, maybe the panelists, how do you respond to John 4:22? I know our conversation has been rather theoretical or conceptual about these big ideas or terms, phrases, but a text. I'd be curious to field some responses here where the Jesus in John is saying salvation comes from the Jews, addressed to a Samaritan. What kind of bearings does this passage have for your readings of John in relation to the questions at hand for this conference today? John within Judaism. All right, you've treated this passage, I think, already. I mean, you have an
I
article on
I
Samaritans,
treated
which
it
I
once
have
in
read.
Beersheba lectures years ago, and I had the title "From the Jews and for the World." And this is the architecture of John 4, of course. Jesus, of course, is a Jew, clearly, and there's no reason to cut out this verse as Bultmann did. But in the end, of course, it's a savior of the world. And that's the line I would say see in this chapter.
Okay. Wally.
I mean, similar to Jörg's here, I mean, I think, I mean, it depends a little bit on how you take the Greek preposition ek, right, from the Jews. What are we talking about there? I tend to think of it a bit more instrumentally. In other words, that, you know, Jesus is engaged with, in conversations with a Samaritan woman, engaged with Samaritan traditions. He engages with her on her terms, but then clearly there's, you know, as he's identified as an Iudaios by her, he then identifies with the Iudaioi using the first person plural. We worship what we know, and I think that's missed by some people. That yes, Jesus never calls himself an Iudaios, but he certainly is identifying with the Iudaioi as a group. But then to make the claim that, you know, salvation, soteria, I mean, however we're thinking about that, whether sort of in dogmatic terms or if it's like a political term in John's first century Roman Palestine, I think that there's some sort of way that salvation is being mediated through Jewishness, right? Through the Jewish people. So it's, you know, it's a tricky thing, but I think it is a fundamentally it's a crucial hermeneutical passage, right, for us in this question about John's relationship to Jewishness, to Judaism, so on and so forth. How you take that will determine the trajectory of your entire framework.
I guess, yeah, I mean, could you not read it though? Sure, salvation is from the Jews, but I mean, I'm giving now a more traditional, typical reading of the text, but now we're gonna worship in spirit and truth, so that we should read John beyond Judaism.
Well, I mean, so you could read into that, you know, salvation is from the Jews and is no longer, right? Or something like that, you know, where you give it some sort of chronological or temporal meaning. But I mean, I think the move then to this, you know, worshiping in spirit and truth, you weren't not going to worship in Jerusalem or on the mountain. Like, I think this to me, I mean, you can locate that very easily within sort of Jewish rhetorical strategies of how to deal with proper worship, right? I mean, I think in some Qumran literature, you have worshiping in this, you know, with the spirit of truth. And so, you know, navigating proximity to the divine is not a, you know, a beyond Judaism type of phenomenon, right? It's a very much embedded within the identity strategies of the Second Temple period, especially as it relates to the question of temple, right? How one relates to temple will take a number of directions. So in any case, I just think that, yeah, it could be taken a number of ways, but oftentimes it betrays our biases when you read into that type of give that type of reading to a simple prepositional phrase from the Jews. I mean, I think you could easily read it as from the Jews and still is from the Jews, right? Or by means of the Jews. So it just it highlights our biases.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy other panelists are raising their hands. Katrin, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick point, because the Samaritan woman then talks about the expectation of the coming of the Messiah. Well, that's not a Samaritan term, it's a Jewish term. And then, of course, the response is an affirmative one. But I also see that, again, as you would expect, I see a lot of kind of scriptural connotations here, that this is in fulfillment of the kind of the prophetic notion of you know what Jesus brings and so forth, and then you know, even to the point that of the inclusion of the Gentiles. I've written a piece on this about, you know, looking at the influence of Isaiah on this passage, and the kind of language you find of anangelo, ego eimi, all that is actually very concentrated in Isaiah 45, which talks about who does not know God, who does know God, and then welcoming in the nation. So I think there's a kind of a scriptural screen again against which we can read that passage, or the last part of it anyway. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks for sharing that response. Yeah, I'm trying to also scroll through a lot of the comments that are in chat button, and I apologize if I, as chair, am not picking up on everything that is being said here. Douglas.
Yes, thanks, Isaac. I just had a quick question, really. Would a first century Jewish peasant use eudioi there in that context? And this goes back to what Isaac was saying of the identity of Israel versus the later development of that word. And so if that is not the way exactly that a first century peasant would talk, then John is introducing a literary device here to communicate it to a broader audience. And in which case, then it raises the question, okay, if he's using a literary device here, then what is he trying to say? And it takes on more importance of him trying to, I don't know, some type of apologetic between these ideas.
Yeah. To me, it seems, well, I've already given my reading of that in my own books. I won't say more, especially since I see Laura. We'll turn to Laura, but I want to come to some of the maybe, Katrin used the term pressure points, which I really liked in the Gospel of John, and Hugo Mendes has highlighted some of them. I think we might want to wrestle a little more with the polemical passages. In particular, this came up. I tried to bring it up with the Gospel of Matthew. I mean, Matthew uses once, I believe, eudioi towards the end of the Gospel. This is the story that still circulates among the Jews, as if, the Jews seem to be a third party, as it were, not us, them. I mean, you could read it that way, but some of the panelists went against that possibility and suggested others. But in John, this is almost on steroids. We have eudioi all over the place. It's not a problem exclusive to John, of course. In Acts, we have eudioi as well. But I'd like to deal with that and deal also with the possibility that the author is not Jewish at all and could have written a text such as John. As Hugo, if I understood correctly, your presentation, you were seriously considering. So before we go to those points, I'll let Laura talk.
I just wanted to continue the discussion that Douglas started, just to say that I think this is why I find it helpful to theorize in Ephesus. I'm not saying there's no continuity with Judea and that area of the world, but I think that we have to think about the language that would have been in the author's head in the location where that writing was happening. And for me, anyway, and I've written about this, but theorizing about how that's going to influence and how we connect what we know about the ancient world and the locations in which we might theorize the gospel is written has to be part of the discussion when we're talking about what ended up being put in the text. Because and again, I'm not arguing for a complete lack of continuity from the first century, but I would prioritize the late first century, early second century.
And just for purposes of clarification for our audience, some who are not specialists or will be watching this later on YouTube, do you locate the composition, the audience in Ephesus, somewhere in Asia Minor?
I wanted very hard to find evidence to be able to say that I could locate it there when I did my thesis. And I ultimately, part of the difficulty is that we're so dependent on what happened to survive. And because of the use of praetorium, because that's such a late calc, I feel like there has to be some Latin in the environs of the composition, but I found evidence for Latin in Ephesus and Alexandria, as well as in Ephesus, or in Antioch and Alexandria, as well as Ephesus. So I think, again, I find it helpful to focus my work on Ephesus as a theoretical proposal, but I fully expect that to be just one point, as others are perhaps arguing for other locations, and we can determine what's most useful, what the differences are, and then also perhaps what seems most likely to us.
Because it's occurring to me, location is also another important matter in relation to our discussion today. Diaspora setting has been mentioned versus a Judean setting. I mean, Judea proper, Israel, Palestine, whatever. Um, and it occurs to me that we have in many passages that can be traced in some way or another, or have been traced in some way or another to Asia Minor, we have this problematic use of Judaioi. In Acts, right, many of the confrontations that are portrayed there between Paul and Jews in the synagogue occur when he's in Asia Minor. Revelation of John, we had a panel on this for the first part of the segment. Of course, the infamous verses, well, I'm not going to say satanic verses because then we might be thinking of the Quran, but the verses where Jews are portrayed as being of the synagogue of Satan are in Asia Minor, right? Addressed to churches in Asia Minor. I'm thinking also martyrdom of Polycarp, if we're expanding beyond the New Testament canon, also uses problematic Judaioi, the Jews, as being complicit with the persecution of Christ followers. And then perhaps also John, if it is written in Asia Minor. There's at least the tradition that John was in Ephesus. Should we understand this in some kind of regional ways? There's something going on with Judaioi in Asia Minor, right? It was Judaioi afterwards that accused Paul in Acts of bringing a non-Jew into the temple court. So just throwing that out there, I do want to come, and it's tied to the two questions I was raising earlier, coming back to the possibility of the ethnicity of the author, which we've talked a bit about, but also the polemical, really the problematic passages, and maybe it's not just passages, the manner, right, that Judaioi are portrayed in this gospel and how we deal with that. Also, one point from Ugo's presentation that stayed with me, are we, by claiming this is a sort of intra-Jewish debate, legitimizing a Jewish text that is no longer part of the mainstream and has not been for centuries, mainstream Jewish world? How do we reckon with this? I mean, it's a really good, serious matter to consider. Maybe a terrifying question. It's going to be on the record now for saying something. Ugo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think immediately after my presentation, the discussion came up in the chat about whether or not the ethnicity of the author, for instance, matters on this sort of question. And my feeling is that it is related on some level to whether we can call a text or Jewish in Judaism, place it within Judaism, read it as an insider Jewish text. I think for me, I would be hesitant as a scholar. Calling a text in Judaism, reading it as an insider Jewish text, if it doesn't have an ethnic Jewish author from antiquity. So to the extent that there's any sort of question about that, and it's kind of the very simple question of, would first century Jews have recognized the text written by non-Jews, let alone one with negative characterizations of Jews, as Judaism, which was the expression that was used, let alone, a Jewish text, an insider Jewish text. And I think that's a real conceptual challenge. And this is where, again, my own historical minimalism, which was really what I was, advancing in my paper, really then leaves me very hesitant in that place. I completely understand, the question about the ethnic composition of the audience, maybe to get back to, kind of Wally's initial questions for me. I think hopefully I put enough perhapses in my sentence about audience, although I do think some of the glossing of Jewish customs and practices convinces me, like Jörg, for instance, that we have to imagine some number of Gentiles in this audience. Katrin may be right that this might simply be a minority audience or an author who's imagining a wider circulation for a gospel that may come into contact with that. But that combination of author and audience leaves me, again, hesitant to call this Judaism exactly, as opposed to what this is. And I think Jörg was right to remind us at the beginning, that so much of this then really is about avoiding essentializations and thinking about perspectives. And from that first century Jewish perspective, I think I'd have trouble seeing it. I think I would be hesitant to impose my 21st century scholarly perspective on this text and categorize it as Judaism, perhaps even over and against some of the ways that first century Jews were interpreting the boundaries of their ethnos, of their literature, of their tradition, let alone, again, the kind of reception of John, reception history of John, which would certainly take this text in very different places. Maybe that sort of is kind of a way of beginning to at least stir the debate again on those sorts of questions, Isaac, even if it's perhaps not exactly the targeted answer. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And you made me think as you were sharing those very helpful deliberations of a piece Shia Cohen wrote on the parting of the ways. I think ethnicity matters. I mean, Shia Cohen says there was no parting of the ways between Gentile Christ followers and Judaism because they were never considered Jewish by the rest of the Jewish world. So then it becomes more of a parting of the ways between Jewish followers of Jesus and other Jews. So that's something Shia Cohen has voiced and written somewhere. The exact publication doesn't come readily to mind. On the other hand, I then thought about Annette Yoshiko Reed's work on Jewish Christianity, Jewish Christian, and her latest monograph, where she is holding on to that label, Jewish Christian, which has been problematized, and many have actually wanted to just do away with it, right? Daniel Boyarin being one of them, but holding on to that precisely because of its heuristic potential in other ways. It obliges scholars of Jewish studies, for example, to consider or even include works such as the so-called pseudo-Clementine literature within Jewish studies, right? And maybe this is a point coming back to why do John within Judaism or Hebrews within Judaism? Well, maybe that's a conversation we should have more with Second Temple Jewish scholars, scholars of early Judaism. They might be glossing over those texts sometimes because it's like, well, that's no longer part of an intra-Jewish debate or something. It's already something beyond the confinements of Judaism as normatively observed. Gabriele.
No, just briefly, I completely understand and I agree with the point raised by Ugo. The problem is that we are coming from a tradition in scholarship in which John was considered a completely non-Jewish Hellenistic gospel. That is, Christology was based on the mystery religions, etc. And we don't want to go back to that. This is a problem. We don't want, because it's not because we don't want, because we are in the post-Holocaust atmosphere, but because it's not correct. On the other hand, we run the risk of exaggerating on the other side. No? So this is the problem of John. For me, the problem of John is this, because when in our text, to a certain extent, it's easier. No, it's easier to say, okay, is in or out. In the case of John, it's very problematic. It's very difficult. We cannot make. I agree with you. We cannot make a clear statement that this is within Judaism because there are a lot of problems. Okay. On the other hand, we don't want to go back to the idea that it's non-Jewish. So we have to find something that makes sense of what the Gospel of John is, without pushing too much to some extreme conclusion, something that makes sense of all the complexity of the problems that we face while reading John. We know that John is a text built on Jewish category, or biblical category. I remember that the first time that we had in January, we had the beginning of this conference. It was John Collins and others that raised the problem of within Israel. Okay, and probably within the religion of Israel, within the diversity of the religion of Israel, so I think we should stress a lot the diversity of the religion of Israel in the first century, and probably trying to accommodate John in this. But at the other end, I understand there are some good marketing reasons why the term within Judaism is effective and provocative and attracts a lot of attention because he answered me some of the questions especially in some parts of the world in which the relationship between Christianity and Judaism.
Maybe turning to another topic here and trying to connect the dots with some of the other panels as well as other works. I mean, Jörg did, and I appreciate this, mention the Johannine epistles in passing. I mean, we didn't organize a panel on the Johannine epistles, although we could have maybe retitled this panel is the Johannine writings within Judaism. I think it's currently, and I'm double checking, what's saying it's called John within Judaism. So it doesn't have to be just the Gospel of John. I'm going to make it now ambiguous, expand the range. I don't know if any of the panels would like to speak about the other works attributed to John. We could include Revelation of John. It is attributed to John. If there's any connection or relationship you see between the Gospel of John with the epistles of John, even the Revelation of John on this question. Is that something you treat, Ugo, in your book? I haven't read in your book yet. Is it just the Gospel of John? I mean, Jörg has his hand raised, so we'll go to him. But I'd be curious to know if there's some other stuff in your book besides the Gospel of John. But we'll start with Jörg.
Well, just a point on the epistles. We have in scholarship the one position that reconstructs the opponent in the epistles with some kind of Jewish group, and the secessionists are those going back to the synagogue. We have that in Hartwig Thüen's commentary also. The point why I'm not convinced about that is, if we had only the epistles, we would never think of problems with Judaizers or Judaizing opponents or that. We in scholarship takes the story or the conflict of the gospel and has put it over the epistles in some way. I do not think that this helps us to find the background of the epistles. So I would rather say, also from the end of 1 John against idolatry, also I would rather say this is more a Gentile context, although some of those missionaries in 3 John have a kind of Jewish habit not to go into Gentile houses.
All right, thanks for that. Ugo.
Yeah, I concur with Jörg. And I also want to say that, obviously there is a minority of scholars who deal with First John who are very happy to see, again, secessionists as being perhaps apostates to Judaism, those who have reverted to Judaism, especially in a reconstructed Johannine community context. I have been less persuaded by those particular ideas. I think in part, not least because we don't see sustained anti-Jewish polemic in First John. I wrote the recent article in the recent Judeophobia in the New Testament teaching volume that Sarah Rollins, Meredith Warren had put together, Eric had put together. And I will say it is something of a challenge to write a chapter on that topic for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, again, because of the lack of sustained polemic. You can definitely write a chapter, I learned, certainly from the reception history of those texts. But yeah, it makes it a little different. As for your question, Isaac, I do have a chapter on the epistles in the book, but I do have my next book that's coming out with Cambridge this winter is The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, where I delve into these topics a little bit more and definitely focus at least some part of that discussion on the question of whether or not we can read First John in this sort of framework as being, in any ways targeting Jewish secessionists and yeah, I again will find that problematic there.
All right, thanks for sharing that. And we are learning about some news about future publications. Douglas.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Jorg said also and highlight it in a way, because if we eliminate the gospel from this conversation, we just have simply the letters, okay? And the letters do not betray this sort of anti-Judaism that, we attribute to the gospel. But we're dealing with two very different genres. The letters, hopefully, are, missives that were sent out, but the gospel is a story, and stories require antagonists. And sometimes those antagonists have to be drawn with sharper lines to make a point across. And, John does go out of his way in the gospel to present a both sideism of the Jews. He's very quick to say, well, some believe, but some don't believe. But you still have an antagonistic spirit that is part of the narrative. But this is a result of drawing sharper lines to make a simple story. John makes the point that he cannot explain everything Jesus did. It would be just too complicated, too long, too difficult. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot here. This is what John tries to do. And unfortunately, the problem is sometimes snapshots are, can be misconstrued and be seen to be misleading.
Thank you. We do have maybe time here for a comment or two, some final comments, or people, panelists who still wanted to say something and didn't have the opportunity. This is your moment to shine before we take a little break for our next and last session of the day, dealing with the other writings within early Christianity, within Judaism. Anybody like to give some final meditations on this panel? It's been an interesting panel for me, a little more of a debate, controversy, as I sense it, with John, at least in comparison to like the conversations we've had with some other books, such as Hebrews. James was another one where I thought people are like, yeah, this is a Jewish text. It's helpful to think of it that way. Here, there's a bit of a machloket, as I like to say, using the Talmud, a controversy. Final comments, Ugo.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll at least throw out the idea that Gospel of John scholarship is very much in flux right now, not least on these questions of historical, critical contexts of the text. And I think, some of us are no doubt responding to that. I mean, Jurgi brought out again, we're no longer working in the late 20th century sectarian Jewish Christian community and all of the certainties of that era. And I think if we, of course, began to straw poll everyone on how exactly they interpret this gospel, we might find some general trends, but we'll also find some very disparate voices on that. Certainly I can imagine mine being one. And I think as long as that's the case, that makes this question a harder one to answer than perhaps it was a generation ago, when there were perhaps more certainties, more unanimities on what the Gospel of John, how it emerged, where it emerged, and what that looked like. And I think as we continue to think and rethink Johannine historical criticism in the 21st century, we're very likely to see this discussion really racked in new ways.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for this great discussion, for this panel. We're going to take a short break so we can set up the shop for our next panel, Other Writings Within Judaism, ? We'll have a variety of texts proposed for you in just a few minutes, so please do consider joining us. In the meantime, a special thanks again for the participation of all the John specialists today.